Picture an old man sitting in Athens, late afternoon sunlight streaming through columns of marble. The year is somewhere around 360 BCE. His name is Plato, and he's writing something strange. Not a philosophical treatise about forms or justice, but a story about an island that vanished 9,000 years before he was born. He calls it Atlantis. Most stories from the ancient world are vague, wrapped in metaphor and myth. But Plato's account is different. He doesn't speak in poetry or allegory. He gives measurements, dimensions, architectural specifications. The kind of detail you'd find in a surveyor's report, not a fable. He describes concentric rings of water and land, each ring a specific width. He mentions the materials used in construction stone quarried in 3 colors, one white, one black, one red. He explains the political structure. A council of 10 kings, who met to renew their oaths every 5 or 6 years. This precision is unsettling. When someone invents a story, they rarely bother with such mundane details. They focus on drama, on heroes and gods, and moral lessons. But Plato writes like he's describing a real place that someone once visited and carefully documented. He claims the story came to him through a chain of witnesses. An Egyptian priest told it to Solon, the great Athenian lawgiver, during his travels. Solon told it to his family. The family passed it down through generations until it reached Plato's relatives, who shared it with him. If true, this is oral history, preserved across centuries. If false, it's an elaborate fiction with an invented pedigree. The question becomes, why would Plato do this? He was one of history's most respected philosophers, founder of the Academy, teacher of Aristotle. His reputation didn't need embellishment. He had no obvious reason to fabricate an entire lost civilization complete with geographic coordinates and societal details. Some scholars argue he created Atlantis as a thought experiment, a way to explore ideas about ideal societies and their corruption. Perhaps, but that explanation feels incomplete when you read the actual text. There's something in the way he writes it, a matter of factness, that doesn't read like allegory. And then there's what he says. The Egyptian priests told Solon that the Greeks had forgotten their own deep past, that catastrophes periodically erase human memory, that civilizations rise and fall in cycles we no longer remember. The priests spoke of Atlantis not as legend, but as history, uncomfortable history, that contradicted everything the Greeks believed about themselves and their world. For more than 2,000 years, mainstream scholars have dismissed Atlantis as Plato's invention. They point out that no other ancient source mentions it. They note that the timeline places Atlantis impossibly far in the past. They argue, reasonably, that an island continent can't just disappear without a trace. These objections are logical. They make sense within our current framework of history and geology. But frameworks can be wrong. The scholars who dismissed Troy as myth were wrong. The academics who insisted humans couldn't have built complex structures before agriculture were wrong. The experts who said civilizations couldn't exist in the Amazon rainforest were wrong. Each time, the ground beneath our certainty eventually shifted. What if our certainty about Atlantis is similarly misplaced? What if Plato wasn't creating a philosophical metaphor, but preserving a memory, however distorted by time? What if somewhere beneath the waves, or buried under centuries of sediment, lies evidence of something we've convinced ourselves couldn't exist? The question isn't whether Atlantis disappeared. The question is whether we're ready to find it. Imagine standing at the edge of the outermost ring. Water stretches before you, a canal wide enough for warships to pass each other without collision. Beyond it rises another ring of land, and beyond that, more water, then more land, each circle smaller than the last, spiraling inward toward a center you can't quite see from here. At the heart of it all, Plato tells us, stood a temple covered in silver and gold, its pinnacle touching the sky. This wasn't a village. This wasn't even a city by ancient standards. The scale Plato describes is staggering. He claims the outer wall encircled a space larger than Libya and Asia, combined terminology that in his time meant regions spanning thousands of square miles. The main island extended roughly 300 miles in one direction, 200 in another. The rings themselves were engineering achievements that would challenge modern construction, let alone Bronze Age technology. Consider the logistics. To create alternating rings of water and land, you'd need to either excavate enormous circular canals or build massive walls to contain seawater. Either approach requires moving millions of tons of earth and stone. You'd need not just labor, but organization, architects, engineers, surveyors, capable of maintaining perfect circular geometry on a scale of miles. You'd need to solve the problem of water flow, ensuring the canals didn't stagnate or breach their walls. You'd need tunnels connecting the rings, passages wide and tall enough for ships to navigate from the outer ocean to the inner harbors. The ancient world did build impressive structures. The pyramids prove that. The Parthenon proves that. But those were single monuments, concentrated efforts at specific sites. Atlantis, as described, would be an entire landscape reshaped by human will, a geographical impossibility made real through technology we can barely imagine. So where could such a place have existed? The most obvious location is beyond the Pillars of Hercules, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar. Plato explicitly places it in the Atlantic Ocean. But we've mapped the Atlantic floor. We know the contours of continental shelves and deep ocean basins. There's no sunken continent out there, no massive landmass that somehow vanished. Some researchers suggest the Azores, volcanic islands that could be mountain peaks of a larger sunken landmass, possible but unproven. Others look to the Mediterranean. Perhaps Plato or his sources confused the geography. Perhaps Atlantis was actually Santorini, the Greek island devastated by volcanic eruption around 1600 BCE. That disaster did destroy the Minoan civilization, and the Minoans were sophisticated, with palace complexes and advanced culture. But the timeline doesn't match. Santorini's eruption was 3,500 years ago, not 11,000. Then there are the radical theories. Atlantis in Antarctica, they say, before the continent was covered in ice. Atlantis in the Caribbean, swallowed by rising seas at the end of the Ice Age. Atlantis in the North Sea, or Indonesia, or a dozen other locations, each theory finding some fragment of evidence to support itself, while ignoring the pieces that don't fit. The contradictions pile up until you're left with an uncomfortable realization. Every location makes sense in some ways, and fails in others. It's as if Atlantis existed everywhere and nowhere, a ghost that haunts multiple geographies without fully manifesting in any of them. Maybe the problem isn't that we're looking in the wrong place. Maybe the problem is that we're thinking about the ancient world with modern assumptions. We assume the past was simpler, more primitive, that advanced civilization is a recent phenomenon. But what if that assumption is the obstacle? What if Atlantis can't be found because we're not ready to see what finding it would mean? 9,600 years before Plato wrote his dialogues, that's when he says Atlantis was destroyed. If we do the math, we arrive at approximately 9,600 BCE, give or take a few decades depending on how you calculate Plato's lifespan. That date places Atlantis at the end of the last ice age, during a period geologists call the Younger Dryas. According to everything we're taught, humans at that time were living in small bands, hunting animals and gathering plants. They had stone tools, animal skin clothing, oral traditions, but no writing. They built temporary shelters, not cities. They had shamans and stories, not governments and bureaucracies. The idea of them constructing a naval empire with advanced metallurgy and monumental architecture seems absurd. It violates the accepted timeline of human development so completely that serious scholars won't even discuss it. Except here's the problem. The timeline keeps getting older. In 1994, archaeologists began excavating a site in southeastern Turkey called Göbekli Tepe. What they found shouldn't exist. Massive stone pillars arranged in circles, some weighing over 10 tons, carved with intricate reliefs of animals. The site was built approximately 9,500 BCE, the same period Plato places Atlantis. The people who built Göbekli Tepe supposedly had no cities, no agriculture, no organizational capacity for such a project. Yet there it stands, impossible and real. Göbekli Tepe changed something fundamental. It proved that prehistoric humans were capable of achievements we'd assumed were impossible. If they could build that temple complex 11,000 years ago, what else could they have built? What else have we dismissed because it doesn't fit our expectations? The Younger Dryas itself is fascinating and terrifying. Around 10,800 BCE, global temperatures plummeted suddenly. Ice returned to regions that had been warming. Then, around 9,600 BCE, temperatures spiked upward just as quickly. Sea levels rose dramatically as ice sheets melted. Coastlines that had been dry land for millennia vanished underwater. Any civilization living on those coasts would have been destroyed, their cities drowned, their people scattered or killed. Some researchers propose that a comet impact triggered these changes, fragments of a disintegrating comet striking the North American ice sheet, causing catastrophic flooding and climate disruption. The evidence is debated, controversial, not yet proven. But the climate change itself is undeniable. Something caused temperatures to swing wildly during that exact period. Something caused massive flooding. Something reset the world. If Atlantis existed during that window, if it was a coastal civilization as Plato describes, then the Younger Dryas catastrophe would have destroyed it completely. Rising seas would have swallowed their cities. Climate chaos would have disrupted their agriculture. The survivors, if any, would have been scattered refugees carrying fragmentary memories of what was lost. Or perhaps Plato's timeline is simply wrong. Maybe he or his sources misunderstood the Egyptian records. Maybe they added a 900 years instead of 9,000 years. That would place Atlantis around 1,400 BCE, making it contemporary with the Minoans, Mycenaeans, and New Kingdom Egypt. That timeline is more comfortable, more compatible with what we know. But it also requires assuming that someone in the chain, Solon, the Egyptian priests, or Plato himself, made a mathematical error and no one caught it. Both possibilities are unsettling. Either human civilization is far older and more sophisticated than we've been taught, or our ancient sources can't be trusted even when they're being specific and detailed. Either way, the foundations of historical certainty crack a little. Either way, we're left wondering what else we've gotten wrong. What other impossibilities might be waiting to be discovered in the depths of time? Your ship approaches from the open ocean, and the first thing you see is light. Sunlight catching on something that shouldn't exist, walls that gleam red and gold, towers topped with what looks like burnished copper but brighter, more alive. As you draw closer, the scale becomes clear. The outer wall rises from the sea like a mountain range made by human hands, stretching in a perfect circle farther than your eye can follow. The harbour swallows your vessel. Around you, ships from everywhere. Egyptian grain carriers with painted eyes on their prows. Phoenician traders loaded with purple dye. Vessels from places whose names you don't recognize. Their sailors speaking languages that sound like music or threats, depending on the tone. The water here is clean despite the traffic, flowing through the rings in channels that somehow stay clear even with hundreds of ships entering and leaving daily. You step onto stones so perfectly fitted that you can't slide a knife blade between the blocks. Everywhere you look, there's metal. Not just bronze or copper, but this strange alloy they call orichalcum, covering walls and columns and statues, warm to the touch and reflecting light like captured fire. The temples rise above everything else, their roofs plated in gold and silver, and at the very center of the city, barely visible from here, the great temple of Poseidon, where they say the laws themselves are written in metal that never tarnishes. This is the Atlantis that survives in memory. This is what people mean when they speak of a golden age. But watch longer. See who does the watching and who does the working. Those men hauling copper ingots from the warehouse to the foundry, their backs are scarred, their faces blank. They don't speak, except in grunts of effort. They don't meet your eyes. Around their ankles, if you look closely, you can see the marks where shackles have worn the skin. The woman carrying water jars from the canal moves like someone who's been moving this way for so many years that her body has forgotten any other possibility. The children, darting through the market, aren't playing, they're stealing scraps, eyes always checking for the guards. The society that built these wonders ran on a hierarchy so rigid that stone seemed flexible by comparison. At the top, the priest kings, men who claimed the god Poseidon himself, flowed in their veins. They lived in the innermost ring, in palaces you'd never see unless summoned, and a summons usually meant you'd done something very wrong or very right. Below them, The warrior-class sons of good families trained from childhood in combat and command, their loyalty bought with land grants, and the promise that their children would inherit the same privileges. Then the merchants, wealthy but never quite respectable, handling the trade that made everything else possible, but always knowing that blood mattered more than gold. The craftsman occupied a strange middle ground. A master metalworker or architect could live comfortably, even own a modest home and a few slaves of his own. But he could never sit on the council. His daughter could never marry into the royal families. His knowledge was valuable, but he himself was replaceable. Below him, the vast population of free laborers, farmers, fishermen, people who worked until their bodies gave out and died without ever seeing the inside of a temple or tasting wine that wasn't watered down or vinegar. And at the very bottom, the slaves, captured in wars, bred from captured parents, sold by families who couldn't feed them, taken in raids on coastal villages that would never be recorded in any official history. They mined the copper and tin that made the bronze. They rowed the warships that protected the trade routes. They hauled the stones that built the temples. They did this until they died, and then other slaves threw their bodies in the sea, and the work continued without pause. The Golden Age was golden only if you were born into the right family in the right place at the right time. For everyone else, Atlantis was a machine that consumed lives to produce magnificence. The temples were beautiful because someone bled to build them. The canals were wonders because someone drowned digging them. The metal caught the light so perfectly because someone breathed poison to smelt it. Paradise has always been expensive. The question is who pays the price. The rings were beautiful from a distance. Up close, they were traps. Water connected everything, which meant disease connected everything. When someone in the outer districts developed a fever, you could track its spread inward ring by ring, following the canal system like a map of contagion. The water that made trade possible also made epidemics inevitable. The inner rings barely moved. Yes, they connected to the sea through those impressive tunnels, but circulation was poor. In summer, the water would grow thick with algae, turning colors that shouldn't exist in nature. Green so dark it looked black, sometimes red like rust or blood. The smell would rise from the canals, a heavy sweetness of rot and stagnant vegetation. Mosquitoes bred in clouds so thick that people learned to eat and sleep with smoke pots burning, trading clean air for something resembling protection. Then there were the metals. That gleaming orichalcum that made Atlantis famous wasn't just beautiful, it was dangerous. Modern analysis of ancient alloys shows that many contained arsenic, lead, sometimes mercury. The Atlanteans didn't know about heavy metal poisoning. They just knew that foundry workers went mad, that their hands trembled, that they died young with their bones soft and their organs failing. The miners who extracted copper and tin from the earth suffered even worse. Lungs full of stone dust, skin stained permanently by contact with ore, eyes that stopped seeing clearly after years in the dim underground passages. Living in the lower rings meant living below sea level in some sections. The engineering was impressive, walls thick enough to hold back the ocean, drainage systems to pump out seepage, but it was never perfect. You'd wake to find your floor damp. You'd notice cracks in walls after earthquakes. You'd wonder, lying in bed at night, what would happen if those walls finally gave way, if the ocean decided to reclaim the space they'd stolen from it. Because earthquakes were constant. If Atlantis sat where most theories place it, the Mediterranean, the Atlantic Ridge, anywhere geologically active, then tremors were part of life. Small ones you learned to ignore, a brief rattle of pottery, a swaying that passed in seconds. But the larger quakes, the ones that came every few years, those killed people. Buildings that looked solid would crack like eggshells. The bridges connecting the rings would twist and collapse. The great walls would hold, mostly, but sections would slump or shear, requiring immediate repair unless you wanted water flowing where it shouldn't. The crowding made everything worse. Population density in the inner rings must have been staggering tens of thousands of people, pressed into concentric circles, their homes stacked and squeezed into every available space. When disease started, it moved like fire. When food ran short, competition became vicious. When summer came and the heat reflected off all that stone and metal, the air itself felt hostile. The elite escaped most of this. Their villas sat on the higher ground of the land rings, where sea breezes reached and elevation provided drainage. They had private wells drawing clean water from deep aquifers. Their homes were spaced apart, gardens and courtyards creating buffer zones against neighbors and disease. When epidemics swept the lower rings, the wealthy would retreat to country estates on the outer reaches of the island, returning only when the dying had finished. For everyone else, the city's magnificence was also its danger. The same engineering that allowed so many people to live in such a small space ensured those people lived badly. The same trade networks that brought wealth also brought foreign diseases. The same metallurgical advancement that created beautiful alloys also created toxic air and contaminated water. You could die from a dozen different causes in Atlantis, and most of them were invisible, built into the very structure of daily life. The city killed you slowly, competently, while you admired its walls. At the heart of the Temple of Poseidon stood a pillar made of orichalcum. On its surface, carved in letters that never tarnished, were the laws. Not all laws those changed with circumstances and royal whim, but the fundamental laws, the ones that couldn't be altered without breaking something essential in how Atlantis understood itself. And every 5 or 6 years, the 10 kings would gather here to renew their oaths. These weren't elected leaders. They were descendants of Poseidon's sons, or so the story went. The god had fallen in love with a mortal woman named Cleito, protected her on a hill by surrounding it with rings of water and land, and had 10 sons with her, 5 sets of twins. The eldest, Atlas, became the first High King. His brothers ruled the other regions. Their bloodlines continued for generations, each king passing power to his eldest son, or nearest male relative if no son existed. This created a closed system. Only the blood mattered. Competence, wisdom, courage, these were desirable, but secondary. A fool born to the right father would rule over a genius born to the wrong one. Over generations, this led to intermarriage within the royal families. Cousins marrying cousins, sometimes closer relations than that, all to keep the bloodlines pure and the power consolidated. The palace intrigues were vicious precisely because the stakes were absolute. If you were born into a royal family, you had only 2 possible futures: rule or be eliminated. There was no retirement from succession, no peaceful life as a minor noble. Heirs who showed too much ambition before their time would disappear. Brothers who competed too openly would die in hunting accidents. Cousins who built their own followings would be discovered plotting treason, evidence appearing conveniently at the perfect moment. For the common person, this meant your entire life could change based on which royal faction won which power struggle. The trade route that made your city prosperous could be closed because a king needed to punish a rival by damaging his region's economy. The building project that employed half your village could be abandoned because a new king wanted to build something else, somewhere else, to establish his own legacy. Military conscription could empty your town of its young men, and whether they ever came back depended on battles fought for reasons you'd never fully understand. Justice itself was theatre. Disputes were brought before priest-judges who claimed to interpret divine will through omens and signs. A man accused of theft might be vindicated because birds flew from the left that morning, or condemned because the sacrifice didn't burn cleanly. The system wasn't designed to find truth. It was designed to maintain the impression that the gods approved of whatever the priesthood decided. And the priesthood was chosen by the kings, educated in the temples, dependent on royal patronage for their position and comfort. This created a culture of careful speech. You learned young not to criticize the kings, even in private, because your neighbor might need to curry favor by reporting you. You learned not to stand out, not to appear too successful or too comfortable, because drawing attention from the wrong people could be fatal. You learned to watch for signs of shifting political winds, to understand which king was ascendant and which was vulnerable, because your survival might depend on backing the right faction at the right time. The laws written on that pillar in the temple spoke of justice and proportion, of kings ruling wisely according to divine principles. But the actual law, the real law that governed daily existence, was simpler. Power flows downward, obedience flows upward, and questioning either one is the fastest way to disappear into the canals, where bodies sink and memories fade. The temple rose from the center of the innermost ring, visible from everywhere in the city. You couldn't escape it. When you woke, it caught the first light. When you worked, it loomed above the rooftops. When you slept, you knew it was there in the darkness, waiting for dawn to reveal it again. Plato describes it with the precision he used for everything else about Atlantis. The outer walls were covered in silver. The pinnacles were plated in gold. Inside stood a statue of Poseidon so massive that his head nearly touched the ceiling, showing the god standing in a chariot pulled by 6 winged horses, surrounded by nereids riding dolphins. The scale alone would humble you. The wealth displayed would remind you of the gap between gods and men. But the real power wasn't in the gold. It was in the story the temple told. Poseidon had fallen in love with a mortal woman named Cleito. He'd protected her by shaping the very earth, creating the rings of land and water that became Atlantis. He'd had children with her 5 pairs of twin sons. And those sons became the first kings, which meant every ruler in Atlantis could trace their lineage directly back to a god. This wasn't metaphor. This wasn't like other cultures where kings claimed divine favor or appointment. The Atlanteans believed their rulers literally carried divine blood. The priests taught it. The rituals reinforced it. The entire structure of society rested on this foundation. Some people were born closer to gods than others, and that proximity determined everything. Think about what that does to a society. Rebellion isn't just illegal, it's blasphemy. Questioning the kings isn't political dissent, it's heresy. The system becomes self-reinforcing, because challenging it means challenging the fundamental order of the universe. You might as well question whether the sun should rise or the tides should turn. The temples dominated every district, not just the great one at the center. Each neighborhood had its shrine, each profession its patron deity, each family its household altar. Religious observance wasn't something you did on holy days. It was woven into every aspect of existence. Before you opened your shop, you made an offering. Before you ate, you poured a libation. Before major decisions, you consulted omens or sought the advice of priests who claimed to interpret divine will. Attendance at ceremonies was mandatory, not by explicit law, but by social pressure that amounted to the same thing. Your neighbors watched. The priests took note of who appeared reverent and who seemed distracted. If you were seen yawning during a ritual, if you were late to a festival, if you failed to contribute to temple upkeep, people remembered. Opportunities would quietly disappear. Business deals would fall through. Your children would be overlooked for apprenticeships. The temples controlled more than worship, they controlled knowledge itself. The great libraries were attached to religious complexes, accessible only to priests and approved scholars. If you wanted to learn mathematics, astronomy, medicine, engineering, you needed temple permission. The advanced knowledge that made Atlantis possible was gate-kept by the same institution that enforced divine right monarchy. This created a surveillance state that didn't feel like one. There were no secret police dragging people from their homes. There didn't need to be. Everyone watched everyone else, and everyone was watched by the priests, who answered to the kings, who claimed descent from gods. The system was elegant in its efficiency. You could live your entire life in Atlantis and never consciously feel oppressed. The religious rituals were beautiful. The temples were magnificent. The festivals brought communities together. The priests were often genuinely learned and sometimes genuinely compassionate. But beneath the ceremony and splendor was a simple mechanism. Convince people that their rulers are divine, and you don't need to force obedience. They'll offer it willingly, even gratefully. And if someone didn't believe? If someone questioned whether kings really carried god blood, whether Poseidon really shaped the earth for Cleito, whether any of it was true, they learned quickly to keep those thoughts private. Because in Atlantis, atheism wasn't a philosophical position. It was treason against reality itself. The temples made sure everyone understood that distinction, and the canals were always ready to swallow evidence of those who forgot. Beneath the public religion existed something else. Layers of understanding accessible only to those who'd proven themselves worthy or been born into families already initiated. They called them mystery schools, and they were both officially sanctioned and deliberately obscure. The public temples taught what everyone needed to know. Honor the gods, obey the kings, follow the rituals. But the mystery schools taught what made those rituals possible. The mathematics behind temple construction, the astronomy that determined festival dates, the engineering principles that kept the canals flowing and the walls standing, the medical knowledge that separated effective healing from superstition. Initiation began with tests. Physical endurance first candidates might be required to fast for days, to endure cold or heat beyond normal tolerance, to stay awake through multiple nights. The point wasn't cruelty, it was filtering. Mystery schools wanted students who could control their bodies and minds, who wouldn't break under pressure, who could keep secrets even when doing so cost them comfort. Those who passed the physical tests faced intellectual challenges, riddles that tested lateral thinking, logical puzzles with no obvious solution, problems that required you to abandon assumptions and see patterns others missed. Again, this was selection. The schools weren't interested in raw intelligence. Plenty of intelligent people failed the tests. They wanted specific kinds of minds that could handle ambiguity and paradox. If you proved capable, you were sworn to secrecy under penalties that weren't metaphorical. Revealing mystery school teachings meant death, but not quick death. The betrayed would be given to the priests for public example. The message was clear. Some knowledge is privileged, and maintaining that privilege matters more than individual lives. The first levels of initiation taught practical skills. Advanced mathematics that let you calculate areas and volumes, essential for construction and trade. Astronomy that explained celestial movements without divine intervention, though you'd never say that publicly. Medicine that worked through understanding the body rather than appeasing gods. Engineering that turned abstract principles into functional structures. But higher levels taught stranger things. Techniques for entering trance, states where initiates claimed to perceive truths invisible in normal consciousness. Methods for influencing others through careful use of rhetoric, gesture, and environmental manipulation. What they might have called magic, but what we'd recognize as applied psychology. Cosmological models that placed Earth and humans in a universe far larger and stranger than public religion acknowledged. The schools taught that reality had layers. The masses saw surfaces, gods angry, gods pleased, fortune random, fate capricious. Initiates learned to see mechanisms, weather patterns that could be predicted through observation, human behavior that followed consistent patterns, natural forces that could be directed through understanding rather than supplication. This created a two-tier society more profound than simple class division. The wealthy and poor might live different material lives, but they shared a conceptual universe. Mystery school initiates inhabited a different reality entirely. They understood how things worked while surrounded by people who only saw effects without causes. The paranoia this generated was intentional. Everyone knew mystery schools existed. Everyone suspected their neighbors of membership. Initiates recognized each other through subtle signals, a phrase with layered meaning, a gesture that looked casual but conveyed volumes, jewelry or clothing with symbolic significance, invisible to the uninitiated. You might spend your whole life interacting with initiates without knowing it. Your merchant might be calculating profit using advanced mathematics while pretending to consult omens. Your physician might be treating you with empirical medicine while attributing success to prayer. Your neighbor might understand why earthquakes happen while publicly attributing them to divine displeasure. For the common person, this was maddening. Important decisions were made using knowledge you couldn't access. People around you possessed understanding that explained the world in ways forever closed to you. Your reality was incomplete, and everyone with power knew it, and there was nothing you could do about it, except hope your children might somehow gain admission to the schools and lift the family into that hidden realm of understanding. The genius of the system was making exclusivity seem necessary. Mystery schools didn't present themselves as hoarding knowledge, they claimed to be protecting it. Certain truths, they taught, would destroy unprepared minds. Some knowledge was dangerous. Not everyone could handle reality unfiltered. This made exclusion seem like kindness, oppression like protection, and maybe they even believed it themselves. Every 5 or 6 years, the 10 kings met in the great temple for a ceremony Plato describes in uncomfortable detail. They would hunt a bull through the sacred enclosure, using only wooden clubs and ropes, no metal weapons permitted. When the animal was finally brought down through exhaustion and coordinated effort, they would cut its throat over the pillar of orichalcum where the laws were inscribed. The blood would flow down the carved letters, filling them, making the words legible in red. They'd collect some of this blood in a bowl, mix it with wine, and each king would drink. Then they'd throw the rest into a fire, while swearing oaths to uphold the laws and support each other as brothers descended from Poseidon. Only after this ceremony was complete could they judge disputes, make decisions, or enact policies that affected the entire empire. This wasn't theatre. This wasn't symbolic. They literally believed that drinking blood mixed with wine transferred something power, connection to divinity, binding force that made their oaths more than words. The ritual had to be performed exactly right, following procedures established generations before, because deviation might break whatever mysterious mechanism made it work. Blood held power in the Atlantean worldview. It carried lineage, which meant it carried divine essence from Poseidon through his sons, through their descendants. It carried life force, visible in how bodies grew cold and still when it drained away. It carried identity, your blood determined, your caste, your potential, your fundamental nature. So blood sacrifice was everywhere, not just in royal ceremonies but in daily religious life. Before ships left harbour, they'd sacrifice a dove and sprinkle its blood on the prow. Before battles, commanders would cut the throat of a ram or bull and interpret its death throes for omens. Before construction projects began, they'd dedicate the site with animal blood. Before marriages were formalized, couples would mingle their blood as well as their lives. The temples smelled like slaughterhouses because functionally that's what they were. The priests maintained altar fires constantly, burning offerings that included not just grain and wine, but animals in staggering numbers. The larger the request victory in war, good harvest, healing from disease, the more impressive the sacrifice required. Calves, bulls, horses, sometimes dozens of animals for major ceremonies. Growing up in this culture would shape you in ways that are hard to imagine from outside. Violence wasn't abstract or hidden. It was religious, public, performed by respected priests in beautiful temples. You'd see your first blood sacrifice as a child, probably before you could fully understand what you were watching. You'd see the knife, the struggling animal, the gush of blood, the careful collection and offering. You'd see this repeated at every major life event and seasonal festival. This casualness about ritual death normalized hierarchy in subtle ways. If gods demanded blood, if divine favor required killing, then perhaps human hierarchies maintained through violence were equally natural. If the kings could hunt and kill a bull with their bare hands as part of sacred ceremony, perhaps their authority over human life was similarly legitimate. The political genius of blood ritual was how it bound the 10 kings together while maintaining tension between them. They had to cooperate to complete the ceremony. They had to trust each other enough to drink from the same bowl, to turn their backs during the hunt, to honor oaths sworn over blood. But the ceremony also highlighted their rivalry. They competed to show strength during the hunt, to demonstrate piety through their dedication, to position themselves within the council's internal hierarchy. For subjects watching these rituals, the message was clear. Your rulers operate on a different level of reality. They perform acts you cannot, touch forces beyond your understanding, maintain connection to divinity through practices that would be forbidden or impossible for common people. This otherness justified their power more effectively than any philosophical argument could. Whether blood ritual actually conveyed power is beside the point. The Atlanteans believed it did, which made it real in the only sense that mattered. And belief, reinforced through repeated ceremony and enforced through religious authority, shaped behavior as effectively as any physical chain. Orichalcum. The word appears in Plato's text repeatedly, describing a metal that covered the walls of Atlantis, that gleamed with reddish fire, that was valued second only to gold. Scholars have spent centuries trying to identify it. Brass, some say an alloy of copper and zinc, others argue for bronze, copper and tin, mixed in specific ratios. Some suggest an unusual combination of copper and gold, creating an alloy that would indeed glow warm in sunlight. The truth is, we don't know. We've lost the knowledge, if it ever existed outside Plato's account. But the implications of advanced metallurgy in prehistoric times are worth examining regardless of what orichalcum actually was. Creating metal alloys isn't simple. You can't just throw different ores into a fire and hope for useful results. You need controlled temperatures over 1,000 degrees Celsius, for working copper and tin into bronze. You need to understand which rocks contain which metals, how to extract them, how to combine them in precise ratios. You need furnaces that can reach and maintain extreme heat, bellows systems to force air and raise temperatures, crucibles that won't crack or contaminate the melt. The Atlantean foundries would have been impressive and terrible. Imagine massive clay furnaces, radiating heat that makes the air shimmer. Men working stripped to the waist, bodies slick with sweat, faces blackened by smoke, the constant roar of bellows pumping air. The acrid smell of burning charcoal mixed with metallic fumes that coat your throat and lungs with every breath. These workers didn't live long. The heat alone would stress their hearts and organs beyond sustainable limits. The fumes, arsenic from certain copper ores, lead from contaminated materials, sulfur compounds, carbon monoxide, would damage lungs and nervous systems. Burns were constant, from splashed molten metal or contact with furnace walls. Eyes would be ruined by years of staring at glowing metal to judge temperature by color. Yet they produced wonders. Bronze that could withstand seawater without corroding, essential for ship fittings and harbor structures. Copper, pure enough to conduct heat efficiently for cooking vessels, and possibly other applications they understood empirically, even without theoretical knowledge. Decorative alloys that caught light in ways that seemed impossible, that stayed bright while other metals tarnished. The question that haunts this technology is, how did they discover it? Trial and error requires generations. Someone had to first recognize that certain rocks contained useful metals. Someone had to figure out how to extract those metals through heat. Someone had to discover that combining different metals created alloys with properties neither possessed alone. Someone had to determine optimal ratios through countless failed attempts. Mountains of slag waste material from smelting would have accumulated around Atlantean foundries, representing thousands of experiments. Each failed batch taught something. This ratio is too brittle, that temperature too low. This ore contains impurities that ruin the final product. Knowledge accumulated slowly, passed from master to apprentice, refined across lifetimes. Or perhaps they inherited the knowledge. Perhaps Atlantis was itself the heir to an even earlier civilization that had already solved these problems. The Bronze Age appears suddenly in various cultures. Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, often already sophisticated, with minimal archaeological evidence of the developmental stages you'd expect. This suggests knowledge transmission rather than independent invention in each region. The strangest aspect is the disconnect between practice and theory. Atlantean metalworkers could produce advanced alloys, but they couldn't explain why their techniques worked. They didn't know about atomic structure, oxidation-reduction reactions, or crystalline matrices. They knew that heating copper ore with charcoal in a furnace produced copper, but they'd explain it through elemental transformation or divine favor rather than chemical reduction. This made their knowledge powerful but fragile. Master smiths guarded techniques as trade secrets, teaching only trusted apprentices. If a plague killed the masters, if a political purge eliminated the craftsmen, if catastrophe struck before knowledge could be passed on, entire technologies could vanish. Without theoretical understanding, you can't reconstruct practical techniques from first principles. You need someone to show you, to demonstrate the exact procedure, or the knowledge dies. Perhaps that's what happened. Perhaps when Atlantis fell, the master metalworkers died or were scattered. Perhaps their apprentices, half-trained and traumatized, tried to remember procedures but got details wrong. Perhaps the exact ratios and temperatures that created orichalcum were lost in the chaos, leaving later generations to rediscover metallurgy slowly, painfully, building knowledge back up from basics. They forged metals that gleamed like captured sunlight, but they couldn't write down why it worked. They built their civilization on technologies they didn't fully understand, and when the foundation cracked, everything built upon it fell. The harbor districts would have been the loudest parts of Atlantis. The constant hammering from shipyards, the creak of wood under stress, the rhythmic chants of men hauling materials, the splash of vessels launching, the multilingual chaos of sailors from across the known world. Plato describes covered docks capable of sheltering entire fleets, permanent naval infrastructure, on a scale suggesting not just maritime capability, but maritime obsession. Building wooden ships that can survive open ocean, requires knowledge most land-based civilizations never acquire. Wood isn't naturally watertight. It splits and warps. It rots when continuously wet. Creating a vessel that keeps water out while remaining flexible enough to handle waves means understanding structural dynamics at an intuitive level that takes generations to develop. The hulls would have been shaped from multiple planks, fitted together with precision that seems almost impossible given their tools. Each plank carefully selected certain woods for the keel, where strength matters most. Different woods for planking where flexibility helps, still other woods for internal supports. Joints sealed with pitch or resin derived from trees, caulked with materials that could withstand constant immersion. The engineering challenges multiply when you scale up. Small boats are forgiving, minor errors won't sink you. Large ships amplify every mistake. The longer the vessel, the more stress on the hull from wave action. The deeper it sits, the more water pressure against the planking. The more cargo or people you carry, the more strain on every joint and beam. Atlantean ships, according to Plato's account, were large enough to carry troops for overseas campaigns, supplies for extended voyages, and trade goods in quantities that made long-distance commerce profitable. This suggests vessels at least comparable to later Greek triremes or Roman merchant ships, serious construction projects requiring coordinated labor from dozens of craftsmen over months. Navigation presents even deeper mysteries. Finding your way across open water without compass, GPS, or detailed charts requires skills that seem almost supernatural to modern people reliant on technology. The Atlanteans might have navigated by stars, learning which constellations rise and set at which times, using stellar positions to determine direction and latitude. During the day, the sun's arc across the sky provides orientation if you understand the principles. But stars and sun tell you where you are, not where you're going. For that, you need understanding of currents, seasonal wind patterns, how wave characteristics change near land versus deep ocean. Polynesian navigators possessed such knowledge, crossing thousands of miles of Pacific through observation and memorization of patterns. It's not impossible, just incredibly difficult, and requiring generational knowledge accumulation. The human cost of naval power rarely appears in historical accounts, but it would have been staggering. Galley rowing, the primary propulsion, when wind failed or maneuverability was needed, was brutal labor. Men chained to benches, hands wrapped in strips of cloth that quickly became soaked with blood, rowing in rhythm called by a drum or chant, hour after hour until muscle failure. Most rowers were slaves or condemned criminals. Naval campaigns meant floating prisons where you couldn't escape, where punishment for breaking rhythm meant lashing, where death from exhaustion or disease meant being thrown overboard. The lucky ones died quickly. The unlucky lived for years as human engines, their bodies breaking down from repetitive stress and malnutrition. When the fleet reached enemy territory, these exhausted men became invasion forces. Soldiers who'd spent weeks at sea, eating stale food and drinking water that had gone foul, sleeping on hard benches, would somehow need to fight immediately upon landing. The physical toll was enormous, which explains why ancient naval campaigns often failed not from combat losses, but from attrition diseases spreading through cramped ships, provisions running out, crews too weakened to function effectively. Atlantis's naval dominance required not just better ships, but the social organization to crew them. You need a steady supply of rowers, whether through slavery, criminal justice, or economic desperation, that makes men willing to accept such work. You need shipbuilding infrastructure and timber resources. You need admirals who understand naval tactics and logistics. You need the ruthlessness to treat human beings as expendable components of a military machine. The sea was their highway to empire, but it was also their graveyard. Storms could destroy fleets in hours. Navigation errors could leave ships lost at sea until water ran out. Shipworms and rot could weaken hulls until they split. Every voyage was a gamble against forces that didn't negotiate or show mercy. When Atlantis fell, all that knowledge fell with it. The admirals who understood currents and winds, the shipwrights who knew which wood went where, the navigators who could find tiny islands in vast oceans. They all drowned or fled, and their expertise died with them. 2 harvests per year. Plato mentions this detail casually, but it reveals how dependent Atlantis was on agricultural sophistication. Most ancient societies managed one harvest annually, storing enough food to last until the next growing season. Two harvests meant either unusual climate or advanced agricultural techniques, possibly both. The concentric rings created unique farming opportunities. The land rings could be intensively cultivated, with water from the canals providing reliable irrigation. But intensive agriculture exhausts soil quickly. You can't continuously plant the same crops in the same fields without depleting the specific nutrients those crops need. The Atlanteans must have understood crop rotation, planting different crops in sequence to maintain soil fertility, or their productivity would have collapsed within a generation. If Atlantis was volcanic, that would explain part of the abundance. Volcanic soil is extraordinarily fertile, rich in minerals that plants need. Ancient farmers wouldn't have understood the chemistry, but they'd observed that crops grew better near volcanic mountains. That periodic ash falls seemed to renew tired fields. That land, which should be exhausted, somehow kept producing. The labor involved in maintaining this agricultural system was constant and exhausting. Irrigation channels needed digging and maintenance. They'd silt up, walls would erode. Flow rates would need adjustment based on rainfall and crop needs. Fields required preparation each season, plowing with animal-drawn equipment, clearing weeds and debris, spreading organic matter to enrich soil. Planting meant hours bent over rows, placing seeds at proper depths and spacing. Tending crops meant constant monitoring for pests, diseases, water stress. Harvesting meant working against time. Crops have narrow windows when they're ready, and weather doesn't wait for convenience. Everyone available would work harvest, from dawn until dark, racing to bring in grain before storms could ruin it. Storage was perhaps the most critical challenge. Ancient grain storage is harder than it seems. You need structures that keep grain dry, but allow some air circulation, that prevent rodents and insects from accessing food, that maintain relatively stable temperatures. Build your granary wrong, and your entire harvest can spoil in weeks from moisture and mold. Build it right, and grain can store for years, providing security against future crop failures. Plato mentions that Atlantis grew everything cultivated, suggesting impressive crop diversity. Wheat and barley as staple grains, certainly, but also vegetables, fruits, possibly olives and grapes, given Mediterranean climate in many proposed locations. They raised livestock cattle for labor and meat, sheep for wool, goats for milk, pigs for efficient protein production. This diversity required knowledge. Different crops need different soil types, planting times, water levels. Different animals need different feeds and care. Managing this complexity across an entire island empire meant agricultural expertise distributed throughout the population, not just a few priests or elites, but thousands of farmers who understood their local conditions intimately. The strategic importance of food control is hard to overstate. Whoever controlled granaries controlled the population more effectively than any army could. In times of crisis, drought, crop failure, or political instability, elites could maintain power by controlling distribution. Loyalty could be purchased with food. Dissent could be starved into submission. The agricultural calendar dictated everything else. Military campaigns were planned around planting and harvest. You couldn't conscript farmers during these critical periods without risking famine. Building projects scheduled around when labor was available. Religious festivals aligned with agricultural cycles, blessing seeds at planting, giving thanks at harvest. This meant most Atlanteans lived lives governed by rhythms far older than their civilization. They woke with the sun because agriculture requires daylight. They worked seasonally because crops don't adjust to human schedules. They worried constantly about weather, pests, disease, the 1,000 unpredictable factors that determine whether people eat or starve. Complex agricultural systems are powerful but fragile. One unusually dry year could reduce harvests below what storage could compensate for. Pest infestations could devastate specific crops. Disease could kill livestock that took years to breed. If the irrigation system was damaged by earthquake, war, or simple neglect during social upheaval, crops would fail and hunger would follow quickly. They built abundance, but that abundance rested on systems that required constant maintenance and favorable conditions. Remove either, and the whole structure could collapse within a season. Beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the Strait of Gibraltar sits the edge of the known world in ancient geography. Any ship wanting to move between the Mediterranean and the Atlantic had to pass through that narrow channel. If Atlantis existed where Plato placed it, just beyond those pillars, it would have controlled one of history's most strategic choke points. Control the strait, control the trade. Every merchant vessel carrying tin from distant northern lands, every ship loaded with African goods heading to Mediterranean markets, every expedition seeking new territories or resources would pass through Atlantean waters. The economic implications are staggering. The harbour district would have stretched for miles along the outer ring. Imagine the chaos and wealth concentrated in that space. Egyptian vessels with their distinctive rigging, carrying papyrus and linen. Phoenician traders, famous for their purple dye, extracted from sea snails. Ships from the mysterious Tin Islands, possibly Cornwall or Brittany, bringing the metal essential for bronze production. African vessels with ivory, gold dust, exotic animal skins. Spanish ships loaded with silver from mines that wouldn't be depleted for thousands of years. The languages alone would create a symphony of incomprehension. Traders developing pidgin dialects to negotiate across linguistic barriers, hand gestures supplementing words. The universal language of displayed goods and offered prices transcending the specifics of grammar and pronunciation. But beneath the apparent chaos was sophisticated administration. Port officials who assessed cargo, calculated appropriate tariffs, collected fees that filled Atlantean treasuries. Standards for weights and measures that prevented cheating, or at least made it more difficult. Systems for currency exchange, whether that meant standardized metal ingots, early forms of coined money, or commodity trading, where goods themselves served as currency. The Atlanteans didn't just tax passing ships, they provided services. Navigation through the strait could be treacherous. Currents, tides, seasonal winds all required local knowledge. Atlantean pilots would guide foreign vessels safely through dangerous waters. For a fee, they'd offer repairs, fresh water, provisions for onward voyages. They'd provide warehousing for goods, waiting for favorable markets or onward transportation. This created a merchant class that grew wealthy, but never quite respectable. They handled the transactions that made everything else possible, but blood mattered more than gold in Atlantean hierarchy. A successful trader might own a fine house, employ servants, eat imported delicacies, but he couldn't sit on the council. His daughter couldn't marry into royal families. His wealth was tolerated, sometimes taxed heavily, but never fully legitimate in a society that valued divine lineage above commercial success. The contradiction must have created tension. The people generating the wealth, the merchants, the ship owners, the traders who risked everything on dangerous voyages, had minimal influence over how that wealth was used. The kings decided where harbours were built, which trade routes received naval protection, how tariffs were structured. Merchants could lobby, bribe, try to influence decisions, but ultimate power rested elsewhere. Trade missions were gambles. Merchant vessels would depart for months, sometimes years, facing storms that could sink ships without warning. Pirates who viewed poorly defended traders as easy targets. Hostile ports where foreign merchants might be robbed or enslaved rather than welcomed. The potential profits made the risks, worthwhile successful voyages, could return value many times the initial investment. But most ventures involved significant losses. Investors would spread risk across multiple ships, knowing that if even one returned safely, the profits might cover losses from others. Atlantis exported metals, copper and tin for bronze production, the mysterious orichalcum that apparently couldn't be found elsewhere. Finished goods, metalwork, pottery, textiles, woven with techniques other cultures hadn't mastered. Possibly luxury items, jewelry, art objects, goods that signified status rather than meeting practical needs. They imported what they lacked, timber, if their own forests were depleted. Specific stones or minerals not available on their island. Luxury foods for elite consumption. Raw materials that their craftsmen transformed into higher value finished goods. This trade dependence meant vulnerability. Disruption to shipping lanes through naval conflict, piracy, or political changes in trading partners could damage the Atlantean economy quickly. They appeared self-sufficient and dominant, but that appearance masked how interconnected they'd become with distant regions. Gold flowed through their ports endlessly, and they convinced themselves it would never stop. The market districts near the inner canals would assault your senses before you saw them. The sound carries vendors shouting to attract customers, buyers haggling loudly to demonstrate they're not fools to be overcharged, animals protesting their fate, children laughing or crying or running through the crowds on errands or mischief. The smell hits next. Fresh bread from bakeries, fish from the morning catch slowly warming in the sun, human sweat from bodies pressed close, animal waste from livestock waiting for purchase, incense from a nearby temple mixing incongruously with everything else. The visual chaos completes the experience. Goods piled and displayed everywhere. Farmers with vegetables, fruits, grain in measured baskets. Butchers with carcasses hanging from hooks, flies already gathering. Craftsmen displaying pottery, leather goods, simple metalwork. Cloth merchants with textiles in colors and patterns, signifying quality and price. The wealthy, shopping with slaves carrying their purchases, haggling more for sport than necessity. The poor calculating whether they can afford enough food to last the week. Money changed hands constantly, though what exactly counted as money varied. Possibly metal ingots of standardized weight copper or bronze bars, marked with official stamps, guaranteeing purity and mass. Perhaps early coins if Atlanteans had developed that technology. More likely, a mix, metal by weight for larger transactions, commodity money for daily purchases. A certain measure of grain might be worth a certain amount of oil or wine, with everyone understanding approximate exchange rates that fluctuated with harvests and demand. Prices revealed status more clearly than clothing. Basic food, bread, grain, beans, vegetables, was cheap enough that even laborers could afford it. Not luxury food, not variety, but enough to survive. Move up the scale, and prices rose sharply. Quality meat rather than scraps. Fresh fish rather than salted. Wine rather than water. Fine textiles rather than rough wool. Metalwork that served aesthetic rather than purely functional purposes. Most people lived close to economic disaster. A few days without work meant hunger. A week without income meant serious crisis. An injury or illness that prevented working could destroy a family completely. There were no safety nets, no public assistance, no unemployment systems. If you couldn't work, you relied on extended family if you had one, borrowed from neighbors who might have little to spare, or faced choices that became progressively worse. This economic pressure created desperate competition. Craftsmen would undercut rivals' prices even when it meant barely covering their own costs. Farmers would rush to market, hoping to sell before prices dropped as more produce arrived. Workers would accept dangerous conditions and abusive treatment rather than risk losing their position to the dozens of others who'd gladly take their place. Money lending filled the gap that family and community couldn't cover. But without institutional banking, lending was personal and predatory. The moneylender knew you, knew your situation, knew exactly how much pressure to apply. Interest rates were high because risks were high, many borrowers couldn't repay. Collateral was physical. Your tools, your home, your family members failed to repay, and the lender could seize everything, including you or your children, to work off the debt through servitude. Emergencies destroyed economic security permanently. An illness meaning lost work, an injury preventing your trade, a crop failure meaning no income that season, a theft of stored goods or saved money. Any of these could trap a family in debt that compounded faster than they could work, eventually crushing them into slavery or starvation. The system concentrated wealth steadily upward. Successful merchants and landowners accumulated capital, which they lent at interest, generating passive income, while borrowers worked harder to service debts. Property ownership conveyed power landlords collecting rent from families who could never save enough to purchase their own homes. Over generations, the gap between wealthy and poor widened until it seemed as natural as the gap between sky and earth. Going to market meant facing this reality daily, calculating whether prices had changed, whether your goods would sell, whether you could afford both food and rent. Watching your children grow up knowing they'd face the same precarious existence. Living in the richest city ever built, while a loaf of bread determined whether you survived or sold yourself into slavery. Walk through Atlantis, admiring the architecture, and you might never see them. The slaves hauling stones for the latest temple expansion, the indentured laborers maintaining the canals, The household servants moving through elite homes like ghosts, visible only when needed. They built everything, maintained everything, made everything possible. And they remain unnamed in Plato's account, because in his world, as in theirs, they didn't matter enough to mention. People became slaves through various paths. Warfare was common. Captured enemies were marched back to Atlantis in chains, sold in markets like livestock, distributed as rewards to victorious soldiers. Debt created slaves too. Families selling children they couldn't feed, individuals selling themselves to cover debts, the desperate accepting servitude to survive. Kidnapping turned free people into property through violence, coastal raids capturing entire villages. Their populations shipped to markets where no one spoke their language or knew their names. Once enslaved, you lost legal personhood. You were property that could be bought, sold, rented, used, destroyed at your owner's discretion. You had no right to refuse work, sexual access, punishment. You had no claim to your children, who belonged to whoever owned you. You had no future except what your owner decided. The conditions varied by type of labor. Household slaves had it relatively better. They worked indoors, learned skills, sometimes earned their owner's trust, and received marginally better treatment. But they still had no freedom, no control, no escape except death, or the rare manumission when an owner felt generous or guilty enough to grant freedom. Agricultural slaves worked the fields in gangs, supervised by overseers who measured productivity and outputs, not humanity. They lived in barracks, worked from dawn to dusk during planting and harvest, ate enough to stay functional, but rarely more. Their bodies broke down from repetitive labor and inadequate nutrition. Their life expectancy was short. Mine slaves had it worst. They extracted copper and tin in dark underground passages, breathing air thick with stone dust, working by dim lamplight or sometimes total darkness. Cave-ins killed regularly. Lung diseases killed slowly. Few mine slaves survived more than a few years. When they died, other slaves dragged their bodies out, and the work continued without pause. Construction slaves built the monumental architecture that made Atlantis famous. They hauled massive stones using techniques that are still debated: ramps, levers, pure human muscle. They dug the canals that defined the city's structure. They mixed mortar, laid bricks, carved decorative elements. Industrial accidents were constant crushed limbs, falls from heights, exhaustion leading to fatal mistakes. Resistance happened despite the risks. Slaves would run when opportunity appeared, though capture meant punishment so severe it served as warning to others. They'd sabotage work subtly, breaking tools or ruining materials in ways that could seem accidental. Occasionally they'd revolt, though such uprisings were quickly crushed with overwhelming violence that made the original oppression seem gentle by comparison. Free workers weren't slaves, but often weren't much better off. Day laborers, hired for temporary projects, had no security work today, didn't guarantee work tomorrow. They accepted whatever wages were offered, because refusing meant someone else would accept. They tolerated dangerous conditions, long hours, abusive treatment, because the alternative was unemployment and hunger. Even skilled craftsmen who owned their tools and learned specialized trades remained vulnerable. They worked long hours under pressure to meet deadlines. They competed for commissions. They could be driven out of business by economic changes or a wealthy patron's displeasure. The moral calculation that justified this was simple. Some people are meant to rule, others to serve. Every golden temple stood on broken backs, and the people enjoying those temples convinced themselves that the broken backs deserved their fate. When the first settlers arrived on the island that would become Atlantis, they would have seen forests, dense stands of oak, pine, cedar, depending on the climate. Trees covering hillsides, filling valleys, growing down almost to the shoreline. Wood was everywhere, seemingly inexhaustible, free for the taking. A single warship required hundreds of trees, not saplings, but mature timber with the right grain and strength characteristics. The keel alone might consume a dozen large trees. The planking, the oars, the mast, the internal supports, each component demanding specific wood types with particular properties. Multiply that by the fleet Plato describes, and you're talking about entire forests converted into naval power. The buildings consumed wood too, Before they built in stone, they built in timber. Even stone structures needed wooden beams for roofs, wooden scaffolding during construction, wooden forms for shaping arches. The temples, the palaces, the homes of the wealthy all required timber in quantities that seemed reasonable when you were building one structure, catastrophic when you multiplied it across a growing city. Then there were the foundries. Bronze production needs heat, sustained temperatures over 1,000 degrees. Charcoal provided that heat, and charcoal came from wood burned in controlled conditions. A single day of metalworking might consume wood that took decades to grow. The smell of foundry smoke would have hung over Atlantis constantly, the visible signature of forests being transformed into metal. At first, the deforestation was invisible. You cut trees near the city because transportation was easier. The forest receded gradually, the walking distance to reach good timber, growing from minutes to hours to days. People noticed but didn't worry. There was always more forest farther away. The island was large. Surely the wood would last. But forests do more than provide timber. Their roots hold soil on hillsides. When the trees disappeared, rain that once soaked into the ground began running off rapidly, carrying topsoil toward the sea. Hillsides that had been covered in vegetation turned to bare rock. Springs that had flowed year-round began drying up as the water table dropped without tree roots channeling rainfall into aquifers. Agricultural land degraded. The rich topsoil that made Atlantis's 2 harvests possible began washing away. Fields that once produced abundantly yielded less each season. Farmers noticed, but didn't connect it to the missing forests miles away. They blamed exhausted soil, angered gods, bad luck, anything, except the systematic removal of the island's vegetative cover. Game animals disappeared as their habitat vanished. Deer, wild boar, birds that had supplemented the Atlantean diet became rare, then vanished entirely. Hunting, once a source of food and sport, became a memory old men shared about better times. The economic impacts compounded. As local timber became scarce, Atlantis had to import it, paying for wood that had once been free, depending on trade routes that could be disrupted, watching costs rise as demand outstripped supply. Shipbuilding became expensive, limiting the naval expansion that had made Atlantis powerful. Construction slowed. The foundries had to pay more for fuel, raising the cost of metal production and making their exports less competitive. Probably some people warned about this. Probably some elder who remembered forests now gone spoke about the danger of using resources faster than they renewed. Probably some priest interpreted the environmental degradation as divine displeasure. But short-term demands always won. The shipbuilder needed timber today, not in 20 years when replanted trees matured. The king wanted his temple now, not after his death. The farmer needed to clear land for crops this season, not worry about erosion that might happen gradually over decades. By the time the crisis became undeniable, reversal was impossible. You can't quickly regrow forests that took centuries to establish. You can't replace topsoil that's washed into the sea. You can't restore springs that dried up when the aquifer dropped below the level of their outlets. The elites probably insulated themselves from the worst effects. They could import food from trade partners. They could build with imported timber or switch to stone. They could relocate to estates on less degraded parts of the island. The environmental collapse hit the poor first, and hardest reduced harvests meant hunger. Higher fuel costs meant suffering through cold. Disappearing game meant protein deficiency. But eventually, environmental degradation undermines everyone. The foundation was rotting, and no amount of golden temples or orichalcum walls could hide that the island itself was dying, consumed by the civilization it supported. The concentric rings were Atlantis's defining feature, the engineering marvel that made everything else possible. But water is hard to control, and the canals that seemed like permanent infrastructure were slowly failing. The rings connected to the ocean, which created the first problem. Tides surged through the channels twice daily, the water level rising and falling with lunar rhythms. Storm surges during bad weather could raise water levels dramatically, flooding low-lying areas, straining the walls that contained the canals. The constant movement of salt water through the system was impressive, hydraulically but devastating agriculturally. If the Atlanteans used canal water for irrigation, and Plato's description suggests they did, then every time they diverted water to their fields, they brought salt with it. Initially, this wasn't noticeable. Salt concentrations in seawater, mixed with fresh runoff, were low enough that crops tolerated it. But salt doesn't leave soil easily. It accumulates season after season, year after year, slowly poisoning the land. Mesopotamian civilizations watched their agricultural heartlands transform into salt-crusted wasteland through this exact process. Farmers first noticed reduced yields. Then certain crops stopped growing entirely. Eventually, the land became white with salt crystals, utterly useless for agriculture. The process is slow enough that each generation might not notice the decline, but over centuries it destroys civilizations. Atlantean farmers probably tried to fix it. They'd flush fields with fresh water, hoping to wash the salt away. But this requires enormous water quantities that they didn't have, and it only works if you have somewhere for the salt-laden water to drain. Otherwise, you're just moving the problem around. Some fields would be abandoned, the farmers moving to fresh land and repeating the cycle. As arable land decreased, population pressure intensified. Regions fought over productive fields. Farmers and herders conflicted over land use. The city demanded more food, while the countryside struggled to produce it. Political tensions rose as different districts blamed each other for declining prosperity. The canals themselves required constant maintenance. Silt accumulated naturally, sediment carried by water settles in slower-moving sections, gradually filling channels. Dredging meant slaves working waist-deep in water, scooping mud by hand, loading it into boats or baskets, disposing of it somewhere it wouldn't just wash back in. This labor was endless and exhausting. As the civilization aged, maintenance became harder. If population declined from disease or warfare, fewer workers were available. If economic crisis reduced the state's organizational capacity, the labor couldn't be coordinated. If political instability diverted resources to military needs, infrastructure was neglected. Without constant dredging, canals filled with sediment. Water depth decreased, making them impassable to larger ships. Flow rates slowed, turning sections into stagnant pools. Eventually, parts of the canal system would become more swamp than waterway, shallow, vegetation choked, useless for transportation. Stagnant water breeds disease. Mosquitoes lay eggs in still water, their larvae developing into adult insects that spread malaria and other illnesses. Parasites that complete their life cycles in water multiply in stagnant conditions. Waterborne bacteria thrive when there's insufficient flow to flush contamination away. The water quality problem compounded with human density. Thousands of people living in the ring city needed to dispose of waste somewhere. They probably dumped sewage into the canals, assuming the tidal connection to the ocean would carry it away. In outer rings with good circulation, this might have worked tolerably. In inner rings, waste accumulated, creating health crises that hit the densely populated poor districts hardest. The wealthy, living in villas on higher ground with private wells drawing clean water from deep aquifers, remained relatively protected. They might notice reduced trade activity as canals silted up. They might see more beggars as agricultural collapse drove rural populations to the city. But the immediate health impacts affected others first, creating a disparity that seemed natural rather than systematic. Hydraulic civilizations are fragile. Their greatest achievement, water management, becomes their greatest vulnerability. The canals that made Atlantis possible were becoming the moat that trapped them, turning paradise into a prison of stagnant water and dying fields. The tremor might wake you at night. A brief shaking, pottery rattling on shelves, a suspended oil lamp swinging. Then stillness. You'd lie awake wondering if more was coming, eventually drifting back to sleep. In the morning, you'd mention it to neighbors. Did you feel that? And everyone did. And everyone shrugged. Just the earth reminding you that solid ground isn't as solid as it seems. If Atlantis existed where most theories place it, earthquakes would have been routine. The Mediterranean is seismically active, sitting where African and Eurasian tectonic plates grind against each other. The mid-Atlantic ridge, if that's where Atlantis was, experiences constant seismic activity as the seafloor spreads. The Caribbean has multiple fault lines, producing regular quakes. Living there meant accepting that the earth occasionally moved beneath your feet. Small earthquakes you learned to ignore, Larger ones killed people. A building that looked solid could crack like an eggshell when the right frequency of shaking hit its resonant point. Stone blocks that seemed permanently locked together could shear apart. The bridges connecting the rings would twist and collapse. People running outside in panic might be crushed by falling debris. The canal walls were particularly vulnerable. Constantly stressed by water pressure, they developed cracks during earthquakes that required immediate repair. If a major section failed, water could flood areas designed to be dry land, drowning people who couldn't escape quickly enough, or destroying structures built without consideration for submersion. Ancient people attributed earthquakes to divine displeasure. Each tremor prompted religious interpretation. What had they done wrong? Which god was angry? What sacrifice would appease them? This created psychological pressure beyond the physical danger. Every earthquake was evidence that they'd failed spiritually, that their religious observances were insufficient, that divine forces might destroy them at any moment. The infrastructure degraded cumulatively. Each earthquake weakened structures slightly. A building might survive 10 tremors and collapse during the 11th, not because that one was stronger, but because the accumulated damage finally exceeded the structure's tolerance. Over generations, the entire city would be living in structures with invisible fractures, weakened joints, compromised foundations. If Atlantis had a volcano, that would explain both the agricultural abundance and the ultimate catastrophe. Volcanic soil is extraordinarily fertile. The minerals make crops grow abundantly, explaining how Atlantis managed 2 harvests annually. Hot springs from volcanic heat could provide heated baths, seen as sacred gifts from the earth. But volcanic mountains are deceptive. They can be dormant for generations, lulling inhabitants into believing they're extinct. Then pressure builds beneath the surface, magma seeking release, and the mountain wakes violently. Minor eruptions might actually relieve pressure, making major eruptions less likely. But if pressure continues building, the eruption when it comes can be catastrophic. Warning signs existed. Increased seismic activity as magma moved underground. Ground deformation as the mountains swelled from pressure beneath. Gas emissions, sulfur smells growing stronger. Animals behaving strangely, fleeing areas before humans understood why. Ancient people noticed these signs. They documented them through religious responses. More earthquakes meant more sacrifices. Stronger smells meant more purification rituals. Animal behavior was interpreted as omens. But they couldn't translate these observations into actionable warnings. They didn't have the conceptual framework to understand that these signs indicated imminent geological catastrophe. They thought the gods were displeased, not that physics was building toward inevitable release. Atlantis probably survived several near disasters, major earthquakes that destroyed sections of the city but left enough intact to rebuild, tsunamis that killed hundreds but not thousands, minor volcanic eruptions that damaged but didn't destroy. Each recovery reinforced the belief that they were protected, that their sacrifices worked, that the gods favored them. This false confidence meant that when the final catastrophe came, the massive earthquake, the volcanic eruption, the tsunami that scoured the island, they were unprepared. They'd mistaken survival for immortality, resilience for invulnerability. The Earth had warned them 1,000 times, but they'd learned the wrong lesson from every warning. According to Plato, Atlantis wasn't satisfied with dominating one island. They built a navy to project power across the known world. They attacked Egypt. They invaded Greece. They sought to conquer the Mediterranean and beyond, claiming territories from Libya to Tuscany. Whether these specific claims are historically accurate matters less than the pattern they represent, the pattern of empires that expand until expansion destroys them. War was expensive in ways that never appeared in victory celebrations. Every naval campaign required thousands of sailors and soldiers away from home for months or years. Ships needed constant maintenance and eventual replacement. Soldiers needed weapons, armor, food, pay. Families left behind needed support when their primary earners were fighting distant battles that might never benefit them directly. The labor shortage would have been immediate and severe. Fields went unplanted because the farmers were rowing warships. Construction projects stalled because the workers were conscripted. Workshops operated at reduced capacity because the craftsmen were fighting overseas. This meant reduced agricultural output, delayed infrastructure maintenance, and economic slowdown precisely when the state needed increased production to fund military operations. Initially, successful conquest could offset these costs. Plunder from defeated cities filled treasuries. Captured populations became slaves who could work the fields and man the oars. Tribute from subjugated regions provided ongoing revenue. For a while, war paid for itself and generated profit beyond that. The spoils justified the expense, and success bred ambition for more success. But empires face increasing costs as they expand. Nearby territories are easiest to conquer and control. You can project power efficiently when your enemies are close. Distant conquests strain logistics. You need permanent garrisons to hold territory far from home. You need supply lines that can be interdicted. You need administrators who govern populations that speak different languages and practice different customs. The occupied territories rebel, requiring military responses that drain resources without generating new wealth. The human cost accumulated with every campaign. Young men left for war and returned, broken if they returned at all. Missing limbs from combat injuries, blinded by weapons or infected wounds. Mentally shattered by violence they'd witnessed or inflicted, unable to sleep without nightmares, startling at loud noises. Reacting to perceived threats with aggression that had been useful in battle but was destructive at home. Ancient societies didn't have concepts like post-traumatic stress disorder. They understood that soldiers sometimes came back changed, possessed by vengeful spirits, cursed by what they'd done, haunted by the dead. But without understanding, treatment was impossible. These damaged men lived among families and communities, their trauma spreading through violence and instability that no one could quite name or address. Perpetual warfare changed culture fundamentally. A society constantly at war begins valuing martial virtues above all others. Courage in battle becomes the measure of worth. Military leaders gain political influence. Young boys grow up expecting to fight, seeing warfare as inevitable and glorious rather than tragic. Civilian achievements, art, philosophy, commerce, seem weak and unimportant compared to military glory. This creates momentum toward more warfare. Leaders trained in military thinking apply military solutions to problems that might be solved through diplomacy or trade. A militarized society develops institutional interests in continued conflict commanders whose status depends on leading campaigns, weapon manufacturers who profit from military contracts, veterans whose sacrifices seem devalued if warfare ends. The strategic trap closes gradually. Once you've conquered territories, you can't easily abandon them without looking weak, inviting attack from rivals who'll see withdrawal as opportunity. You need constant military pressure to prevent rebellion, but that pressure exhausts your resources and population. Conquered peoples wait patiently for any sign of weakness, while rival powers watch for chances to challenge your dominance. Plato explicitly states that in their final years, the Atlanteans became increasingly aggressive and unjust. Perhaps the priesthood that once moderated royal ambitions lost influence to military factions. Perhaps constant warfare coarsened society, making cruelty normal and compassion seem like weakness. Perhaps corruption spread as conquest wealth concentrated in fewer hands, making leaders more concerned with personal power than collective welfare. Empires rarely recognize overextension until collapse is imminent. Questioning expansion is political suicide. You'll be called weak, cowardly, unpatriotic. Economic problems get blamed on external enemies rather than examined as consequences of unsustainable commitments. They conquered the world and called it glory, never realizing they were conquering themselves, that every distant victory was a step toward ultimate defeat. The Council of 10 Kings was supposed to govern according to ancient laws inscribed on the orichalcum pillar. They were supposed to meet periodically, renew their oaths, make decisions collectively for the good of all Atlantis. They were supposed to remember their divine descent from Poseidon, letting that ancestry guide them toward wisdom and justice. But Plato says something changed. Over generations, the divine portion in their nature was diluted by mortal admixture. They became consumed by ambition, corrupted by power and wealth. They stopped governing and started ruling, or trying to rule, because real authority requires legitimacy that commands, rather than merely coerces. Succession became warfare by other means. When a king died, His sons didn't peacefully inherit according to clear rules. They fought, forming factions among nobles and generals, making promises they might not keep, eliminating rivals through poison or arranged accidents or accusations of treason that were really just political convenience. Each of the 10 kingdoms experienced these succession crises, and the conflicts could spill across borders when different factions in different regions formed alliances. The council itself fractured into competing blocs. Kings who should have been working together for common interests instead pursued contradictory policies. Trade agreements one king wanted, another blocked. Military campaigns one faction supported, another undermined. Building projects that would benefit some regions at others' expense became flashpoints for conflict that had nothing to do with the projects themselves and everything to do with which king would gain prestige from completion. For ordinary citizens, this political instability was worse than foreign wars. At least with external enemies, you knew who to fight and who to support. Civil conflict destroyed those certainties. Different regions had different loyalties. Soldiers who should protect against invasion instead battled each other over dynastic disputes that meant nothing to the people dying in them. Trade between regions stopped as internal borders became militarized. Infrastructure fell into neglect because no one could agree on priorities or funding. The priesthood that once mediated conflicts became part of the problem. Different temples backed different kings, using religious authority as a political weapon. They'd declare one faction divinely favored and another cursed. They'd interpret omens to support whoever paid them or threatened them most effectively. Religious authority fractured just when society needed spiritual unity most desperately. Generational change accelerated the decline. The founding generations who built Atlantis from nothing understood sacrifice because they'd made real sacrifices. They understood cooperation because cooperation had been necessary for survival. But their descendants inherited wealth and power as birthright. They'd never known poverty, never worked with their hands, never needed to cooperate for mutual benefit. They took prosperity for granted, believing their privilege was natural and permanent rather than constructed and fragile. When challenges emerged, agricultural decline, resource scarcity, military setbacks, these later generations lacked resilience. They couldn't imagine austerity because they'd never experienced it. They couldn't accept collective sacrifice because they'd been taught their comfort was divinely ordained. They blamed others rather than examining systemic problems, scapegoating the poor, foreigners, or rival factions rather than acknowledging that the entire structure was failing. The growing gap between rich and poor made governance nearly impossible. The wealthy demanded protection of their property and privileges. The poor demanded redistribution, relief, intervention in markets that were starving them. Any policy that helped one group threatened the other. Political paralysis resulted no faction strong enough to impose its vision, but each capable of blocking everyone else. Laws proliferated as authorities tried to control chaos through regulation. Travel restrictions to prevent populations from fleeing. Assembly bans to prevent organizing. Censorship of criticism to maintain the fiction that everything was fine. Collective punishment for regions that showed insufficient loyalty. These measures created temporary order while building pressure that would eventually explode. By the final years, Atlantean government was hollow. Kings reigned without being able to govern. Laws existed without being obeyed. Institutions persisted through momentum, while having lost legitimacy. The whole structure was held together by fear and habit, rather than shared purpose or genuine authority. When catastrophe came, there was no capacity for collective response. No one trusted leaders to make good decisions. No one believed sacrifices would be fairly distributed. Every faction pursued its own survival, and that fragmentation guaranteed collective doom. 10 thrones, 1 city, 0 trust. When the kings turned on each other, the empire had already fallen. People can endure terrible hardship if they believe it's inevitable, if everyone suffers equally. If there's hope, things might improve. But when workers starve while watching elites feast, when soldiers die while nobles avoid service, when taxes rise while services disappear, endurance transforms into rage. The trigger could have been anything. A bad harvest that sent grain prices beyond what most families could afford, a military defeat that meant soldiers died without glory and no loot returned to justify the loss. an earthquake that destroyed worker housing, while the state prioritized rebuilding elite districts. An execution or punishment of someone popular, someone who'd voiced grievances others felt but feared to express. However it started, urban unrest follows predictable patterns. Crowds gather in market squares, initially just to share grievances. Someone makes a speech, putting into words what everyone's been thinking. The crowd grows, emboldened by numbers. Anger finds focus: a tax collector's office, a grain warehouse, a wealthy merchant's home. The first stone gets thrown, the first window breaks, and suddenly the line between protest and riot disappears. The chaos would be terrifying even for participants. Warehouses looted for food that people were genuinely hungry for, but also random destruction driven by rage without clear target. Wealthy homes burned, partly as political statement, but partly as score settling for personal grievances. Violence that started with legitimate cause, spiraling into attacks on anyone who looked prosperous or different or simply vulnerable. The city guard would respond, but urban riots are nearly impossible to suppress by force alone. You need overwhelming numbers, and guards face crowds that include their own families, neighbors, people they know and sometimes sympathize with. Ordering soldiers to kill civilians, protesting real grievances creates moral crisis that weakens enforcement even when orders are followed. Slave revolts were even more dangerous. The enslaved population outnumbered free citizens, concentrated in strategic locations, farms that produced food, mines that extracted metals, workshops that manufactured goods. Any disruption in normal control guards deployed elsewhere. Economic crisis, reducing surveillance, political instability, dividing elite attention could trigger uprising. Successful slave revolts were every ancient elite's nightmare. Spartacus's rebellion terrified Rome not because of military threat, but because it demonstrated that the foundation of their economy could rebel and fight effectively. Atlantis, with its massive slave population, would have faced constant low-level resistance, sabotage, work slowdowns, escapes, and periodic attempts at organized revolt. Authorities initially respond with violence, arrest leaders, kill enough protesters to terrify others, display punished rebels publicly as warnings. But if unrest is widespread, violence alone fails. You need too many soldiers, and soldiers start questioning orders. Perhaps reforms get promised food distribution, tax reduction, scapegoat officials sacrificed to popular anger. But reforms show weakness, encouraging more demands. The impossible position of failing states, harsh enough to inspire more resistance, lenient enough to seem vulnerable. The psychological toll would affect everyone. Citizens never knowing when violence would erupt, classes viewing each other with suspicion and hatred, the breakdown of civic trust that makes societies function. People stop cooperating beyond immediate family. Public spaces deteriorate. No one believes in collective future because there isn't one. This creates opportunities for ambitious leaders who ride popular anger to power. They promise radical change, restoration of justice, punishment for the corrupt elite. Sometimes they're genuine reformers. More often they're demagogues who use popular support to establish new tyrannies that ultimately repeat the patterns they claim to oppose. In the chaos of Atlantis's final years, perhaps several such figures emerged, each briefly succeeding before being overthrown, each regime reversing the last's policies, the instability preventing any coherent response to accelerating crises. Social disintegration might have been well advanced before the final catastrophe. Perhaps Atlantis wasn't a healthy civilization destroyed at its peak, but a failing state already in crisis when geological disaster struck. Perhaps the earthquake or tsunami or volcanic eruption was just the final blow to something already dying, the mercy killing of an empire that was tearing itself apart. The question becomes, what actually destroyed Atlantis? Was it the natural disaster Plato describes, or was it the internal collapse that made the civilization unable to survive any additional shock? When you build a society on chains, you shouldn't be surprised when those chains become nooses around everyone's necks. The eclipse came in the middle of the day. One moment the sun blazed overhead, the next a shadow began creeping across its face. People stopped working, stopped talking, stood watching as daylight dimmed to twilight at noon. Birds fell silent, the temperature dropped. For a few minutes, The world held its breath, while something impossible happened in the sky. Then the shadow passed. The sun returned. Life resumed, but people remembered. Ancient peoples paid attention to signs that we dismiss as natural phenomena. An eclipse wasn't just celestial mechanics. It was the gods expressing displeasure or warning of change. A comet streaking across the night sky wasn't ice and rock, but a divine message written in fire. When animals behaved strangely, when fish died in the canals for no apparent reason, when dogs howled continuously through the night, when livestock produced deformed offspring, all of this meant something. The priesthood held responsibility for interpretation. They studied the signs, consulted the sacred texts, performed divination rituals, and advised the kings about what the gods wanted or warned against. But this created impossible positions. Warn of coming disaster and recommend expensive changes, you anger political leaders who don't want to hear bad news. Predict catastrophe and watch nothing happen, you lose credibility. Stay silent when disaster strikes, and you're blamed for failing in your fundamental duty. Most priests learned to equivocate. They'd offer predictions vague enough to fit multiple outcomes. They'd hedge warnings with conditions that let them claim accuracy regardless of results. They'd suggest rituals and sacrifices that satisfied religious obligations without demanding real policy changes that might threaten powerful interests. But probably some priests saw patterns in the accumulating signs that genuinely terrified them. Perhaps they warned privately, tried to convince kings that something unprecedented was building. Perhaps they were dismissed as alarmists, told that Atlantis had weathered crises before and would weather this one too. And there would have been prophets there, always are. Individuals claiming direct communication with the divine, speaking prophecies about coming doom. Perhaps someone stood in the market square declaring that the gods would punish Atlantean arrogance, that the sea would reclaim what humanity had stolen, that fire would rain from the sky. Perhaps these figures were ridiculed, persecuted, driven out. Perhaps some were killed to silence messages no one wanted to hear. The cognitive barriers to heeding warnings are universal. We assume the future will resemble the past, that catastrophes happen to other people in other places, but not here, not to us. We believe we're special, protected, that our civilization's power makes us invulnerable. We resist changing course, because it means admitting our current path is wrong, that all the investment and sacrifice was wasted. We prefer comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. Picture a council meeting, where a senior priest warns that the increasing frequency of earthquakes signals unprecedented geological stress. The king listens, then argues that Atlantis has always experienced earthquakes, that they've rebuilt before and can rebuild again, that stopping current building projects would show weakness to enemies. The priest leaves, knowing he tried, knowing he'll be blamed later, knowing that political reality makes his warnings useless. Or imagine a merchant who's traveled widely, who returns with stories of other civilizations destroyed by floods, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions. He tries to warn that Atlantis's location makes it vulnerable to similar disasters. People dismiss him. Atlantis is unique, blessed by Poseidon, protected by divine favor. The merchant's stories are interesting but irrelevant because they happen to other people who lacked Atlantis's advantages. Perhaps a philosopher argues that imperial aggression will provoke divine retribution, that hubris always precedes downfall. He's labeled a coward, possibly a traitor, someone who doesn't understand the realities of power. The tragedy isn't that no one saw danger coming. The tragedy is that some people probably did see it, did try to warn, did attempt to change course, and failed, because warnings require not just speaking truth, but having an audience capable of hearing it. They saw the signs written in earth and sky, but chose to believe the comfortable lie instead of the uncomfortable truth, because the truth demanded changes no one was willing to make. The earthquakes came more frequently. Not major ones, just tremors that rattled pottery, swayed hanging lamps, woke people briefly before they drifted back to sleep. Where there might have been 1 or 2 per month previously, now there were several per day. People mentioned it to each other, discussed whether the gods were particularly displeased about something, wondered if they needed to increase sacrifices or perform additional purification rituals. Life continued. The tremors were unsettling but not destructive. Buildings still stood. No one died. After a while, You got used to it the way you get used to any constant low-level disruption, learning to ignore what you can't control. If Atlantis had volcanic features, subtle changes would have been occurring. Hot springs that had been comfortably warm might have grown uncomfortably hot. Coastal waters in certain areas might have warmed enough that fish populations shifted, moving to cooler regions. The sulfur smell that had always been present near volcanic vents might have intensified, making people avoid those areas or complain about the stench. Fishermen would have noticed the changing patterns. Their catches declined in traditional fishing grounds. They ventured farther from shore to find adequate hauls. Some would have complained, wondering if they'd done something to offend Poseidon, questioning whether they needed to make larger offerings before departing. The sky would have been behaving strangely. Unusual cloud formations that didn't match normal weather patterns. Strange lights occasionally visible at night, earthquake lights, though the Atlanteans wouldn't have called them that. Electrical charges building in stressed rock, creating brief glows on the horizon that looked like distant fires but weren't. Sunset colors more vivid than usual. The atmosphere refracting light differently through particles and gases being released from underground. Ancient peoples were extraordinarily observant of celestial phenomena. These atmospheric anomalies would have been recorded by priests, discussed by philosophers, interpreted as omens. But the interpretations would focus on divine meaning rather than physical causation. What are the gods trying to tell us? What do these signs portend? Not, what geological processes create these effects, and what do those processes indicate about future events? Animals would have been acting strangely, dogs barking incessantly, hackles raised, staring at nothing visible to humans. Horses refusing to enter certain buildings or areas, becoming skittish and difficult to control, birds abandoning nests before their chicks had fledged. Rats and mice appearing in unusual numbers in the streets as they fled underground, burrows ahead of humans who couldn't sense what they sensed. This animal behavior would be terrifying precisely because it was inexplicable. People understand danger they can see or name. But when the natural world reacts to something invisible, something only animals perceive, dread builds without clear focus. Perhaps they'd think the gods were turning the animals against them. Perhaps they'd perform rituals to restore harmony between humans and the natural world. The ocean might have behaved unusually. Tides that didn't match expected patterns, water that receded farther than normal during low tide, exposing seafloor usually underwater. Changes in wave characteristics that experienced sailors would notice without quite being able to articulate. The appearance of underwater springs bubbling up in new locations, or existing springs that suddenly ran warm instead of cold or vice versa. Sailors and fishermen would definitely have warned others about these changes, but their warnings would compete with normalcy bias. Yes, the ocean seems strange, but it's probably just seasonal variation. Yes, things feel different, but we don't understand the ocean perfectly anyway. Yes, it's concerning, but what are we supposed to do about it? Abandon the city based on unclear threats? In the final days, the anxiety would have been palpable. Too many signs accumulating, too many anomalies that individually seemed manageable but collectively suggested something unprecedented building. People would rationalize we've survived worse. The priests are performing the right rituals. The gods have always protected us. They'd suppress the growing fear because acknowledging it meant confronting possibilities too terrible to accept, that everything could end. That their power and wealth and divine favor might be irrelevant against forces they didn't understand and couldn't control. The earth whispered its intentions for weeks, but they heard only what they wanted to hear until the whispering stopped and the screaming began. How do you destroy an advanced civilization so completely that it vanishes from history except as myth? What kind of catastrophe leaves so little evidence that later generations debate whether it existed at all? The most commonly proposed mechanism is volcanic eruption. If Atlantis was Santorini, the Aegean island where Minoan civilization thrived, then the eruption around 1600 BCE provides a template. The explosion ejected approximately 60 cubic kilometers of material, enough to darken skies across the Mediterranean. The island's center collapsed into the sea, creating a caldera that remains today. Pyroclastic flows would have killed everyone on the island instantly, superheated gas and rock traveling faster than anyone could run, incinerating everything. Ash would have buried survivors, toxic gases suffocating those who found underground shelter. But the destruction wouldn't be limited to the island itself. The eruption would trigger tsunamis radiating outward at airplane speeds, waves growing as they approach shore. Coastal settlements hundreds of miles away would face walls of water, dozens of feet high, arriving with perhaps minutes of warning, the ocean receding unnaturally, then returning with annihilating force. Earthquake and tsunami offer another possibility. A magnitude 9 earthquake on a subduction zone near Atlantis would devastate structures built without modern seismic engineering. When the ocean floor suddenly shifts, dropping or rising during the quake, it displaces massive water volumes. The resulting tsunami would propagate outward, growing in height as it reached shallow water. A city built at sea level, surrounded by water like Atlantis supposedly was, would be perfectly positioned for complete destruction. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis suggests a different mechanism. Around 10,800 BCE, something struck North America, possibly fragments of a disintegrating comet. The impact would have triggered global catastrophe, immediate devastation in the impact zone, ejecta raining fire across the continent, tsunamis circling the globe, atmospheric dust causing rapid climate change. If Atlantis existed during that period and was struck or near the impact zone, nothing would survive. The civilization would be erased so thoroughly that later peoples might preserve only fragmented memories that eventually became myth. Or perhaps Atlantis was destroyed by humans rather than nature. A military defeat so complete that the city was razed, the population killed or enslaved, the infrastructure systematically dismantled. This would require either overwhelming military superiority or internal betrayal. Gates opened from inside, defenses sabotaged, the city delivered to enemies by those who should have protected it. Victors might deliberately erase evidence of Atlantis's existence, destroying records and monuments to prevent the memory from inspiring future resistance. Most likely, if Atlantis fell, it faced multiple simultaneous catastrophes. Imagine an earthquake striking a civilization already weakened by internal conflict, resource depletion, and environmental degradation. Structures damaged by the quake catch fire as oil lamps spill and cooking fires spread. People flee to the harbor seeking escape by sea, but the earthquake has triggered a tsunami that arrives before ships can launch. The combination of earthquake, fire, and flood destroys what any single disaster might have left salvageable. The specific mechanism matters less than the vulnerability. Atlantis, despite whatever advancement it achieved, was mortal, subject to forces beyond human control or understanding, unable to protect itself from nature's indifference or humanity's violence, fragile despite apparent strength, temporary despite seeming permanent. Cities have vanished this completely before. Santorini buried under ash, Pompeii frozen in time by volcanic fury, Helike swallowed by earthquake and tsunami, lost for 2,000 years. These weren't myths, but real places that suffered real catastrophes. In the end, it didn't matter how mighty they were. The earth doesn't negotiate, the sea doesn't compromise, and time erases everyone equally. Atlantis's fate is every civilization's fate, just compressed into dramatic finality that makes the lesson impossible to ignore. The baker woke before dawn, as he always did. His hands moved through familiar motions, measuring flour, mixing water, kneading dough. The ovens were heating by the time the sky began to lighten. Another day. Another batch of bread for the market. His son slept upstairs, and in a few years the boy would wake this early too, learning the trade that had fed their family for 3 generations. Across the city, a metalsmith was stoking his forge. A noblewoman was selecting which jewelry to wear. A slave was drawing water from the canal, the morning light catching on the surface. A soldier was changing watch at the palace gate, tired from a night of standing, relieved to be going home. A priestess at the temple was recording last night's astronomical observations in careful script. Fishermen were preparing their boats in the harbor. Merchants were opening shop fronts. Farmers on the outer lands were already in their fields, checking irrigation channels, planning the day's work. Children were waking, some excited for their daily routines. Others dragged reluctantly from sleep by parents with work to do. The sun rose over the concentric rings, and for a few moments the city was golden. The orichalcum walls caught the light and held it, reflecting warmth across the water. It was beautiful. It was always beautiful at this hour, before the heat and noise of the day accumulated. Then, mid-morning, the earthquake came, stronger than the tremors they'd been experiencing. Buildings cracked with sounds like breaking bones. A section of canal wall collapsed, water gushing into a district that wasn't supposed to flood. People rushed into the streets, some screaming, most just trying to get away from structures that might fall. The shaking lasted perhaps a minute, perhaps less. Time distorts during these moments. When it stopped, there was a brief, profound silence, the city holding its breath, wondering if more was coming. Nothing came. People began emerging from wherever they'd taken shelter, assessing damage, checking on neighbors, finding bodies of those who'd been unlucky, crushed by falling stones, drowned in the unexpected flood. But most people survived. Most structures still stood, though many were damaged. The council convened to organize repairs. Priests rushed to temples to interpret what the gods were saying through this event. People began the work of clearing rubble, shoring up cracked walls, retrieving belongings from damaged homes. There was even dark humor in the markets, jokes about the gods' bad moods, gallows laughter that helps humans process fear. By midday, people were beginning to relax. They'd survived. They'd weathered worse earthquakes in living memory. This was manageable. Repairs would take time, but they had time. Life would return to normal. They were wrong. The main earthquake struck in early afternoon. Not a tremor, not even a strong shake. The earth moved, not side to side but up and down, waves rippling through solid ground as if it were water. Buildings didn't crack, they shattered, imploded, collapsed into rubble so complete you couldn't tell what they'd been. The bridges connecting the rings twisted and fell. Sections of the island dropped, others rose, the concentric circles rupturing as the underlying geology rearranged itself. The canal walls failed. Water flooded through breaches, drowning districts in seconds. People trying to flee found themselves trapped between collapsing buildings and rising water, choosing between crushing and drowning. Then the ocean pulled back. Anyone near the shore watched water recede beyond any low tide they'd ever seen, exposing seafloor that hadn't been dry in living memory. Fish flopped on wet sand. Ships in the harbor settled onto the bottom. There was a moment, perhaps a minute, perhaps 5, of eerie stillness. The tsunami appeared as a line on the horizon, then closer. Then a wall of water taller than the buildings, carrying debris and ships and everything the retreating ocean had collected. It moved faster than a running horse. There was no time to reach high ground, barely time to understand what you were seeing before it arrived. The wave didn't just flood the city, it scoured it. When the water finally receded, pulling back to the sea, it took almost everything with it. Buildings reduced to foundations, people gone, the concentric rings broken into unrecognizable fragments. By evening, Atlantis was gone. The survivors, if there were any, clung to whatever high ground remained, watching the sun set on a transformed world. They woke in paradise and died in chaos. And between those moments, eternity compressed into hours. Picture a merchant ship 3 days out from Atlantis when the island died. The crew notices nothing. No earthquake reaches them through deep water. No tsunami forms beneath their hull. They sail on, completing their voyage to some distant port, unloading cargo, beginning the return journey. Only when they approach home waters do they realize something is wrong. The landmarks they navigate by are gone or changed. The harbor they know intimately doesn't exist. Where the concentric rings should rise from the sea, there's only open water, debris floating, bodies, the ruins of other ships. They search for survivors, for some explanation, finding neither. What do you do when your home no longer exists? When everyone you knew is dead? When the entire framework of your identity has been erased? Some Atlanteans were abroad when catastrophe struck. Merchants conducting business, diplomats negotiating treaties, scholars studying in foreign lands, soldiers stationed in distant territories. They learned about the destruction gradually, as ships failed to return, as news traveled slowly through ancient communication networks. They'd faced the psychological crisis of becoming refugees who couldn't go home because home had ceased to exist. The lucky ones had families with them. The unlucky ones had left spouses, children, parents behind. They'd lived the rest of their lives not knowing exactly how their loved ones died, imagining it in dreams, carrying guilt that they survived when others didn't. Some probably tried to preserve Atlantean culture, teaching their children the language, though who would they speak it to? Maintaining customs, though in foreign contexts these would seem strange, markers of difference rather than belonging. Telling stories about the lost homeland, though each retelling would change details slightly, memory degrading, with repetition and time. Perhaps some wrote things down, descriptions of Atlantis, its geography, its government, its knowledge. Scrolls or tablets that might have survived into later antiquity, copied and recopied, eventually reaching someone who passed the story to someone else, who told it to another, until finally Solon heard it from Egyptian priests, who'd preserved the account for generations. But oral transmission across centuries is like a game of telephone. The essential framework might remain advanced civilization destroyed by catastrophe, while details become confused or embellished. Was the city as large as Plato describes, or did memory and retelling exaggerate? Were they as advanced, or did nostalgia and loss make the past seem golden by comparison with survivors' diminished circumstances? Cultures without homelands struggle to maintain distinct identities. The first generation clings to who they were. The second generation straddles two worlds, parents' memories of Atlantis and their own experience growing up elsewhere. The third generation identifies with their birthplace. They might know they have Atlantean ancestry, might preserve fragments of stories, but they're Egyptian or Greek or Mesopotamian now, not Atlantean. Languages die when daily use ends. Customs seem pointless when disconnected from context. Within a few generations, survivor communities would have assimilated almost completely, leaving only traces, family stories, unusual practices, fragments of knowledge that seem to have no clear origin. Perhaps some survivors carried technical knowledge from the mystery schools. Advanced metallurgy, astronomical observations, mathematical techniques, engineering principles. If they taught these to new civilizations, it would explain why certain technologies appear somewhat suddenly in the archaeological record, already sophisticated without clear developmental stages. This feeds speculation about hidden influences on human development. Did Egyptian knowledge of astronomy and engineering benefit from Atlantean refugees? Did Greek mystery cults preserve Atlantean initiatory practices? Did Mesoamerican pyramids and Mesopotamian ziggurats share a common ancestor in Atlantean architectural tradition? We can't know. The evidence is too fragmentary, the time too distant, the claims too extraordinary to accept without proof. But imagine being the last one, the last person born in Atlantis, the only one left who remembers it as lived experience rather than family story. Your language has no native speakers, except you. Your gods are worshipped by no one else. You're a living ghost of a dead world. Perhaps you find a philosopher willing to listen. You tell him everything you remember, hoping someone will preserve it, hoping your civilization won't be completely forgotten. They carried a dying world in their memories, and when they died, the last light of Atlantis finally went out. The search for Atlantis has consumed researchers, explorers, and dreamers for thousands of years. Every proposed location presents tantalizing possibilities and insurmountable problems. Santorini seems promising, an actual Bronze Age civilization destroyed by volcanic eruption, sophisticated architecture, advanced culture, catastrophic end. The Minoan settlement buried under ash matches parts of Plato's description, but the timeline is wrong. Santorini exploded around 1,600 BCE, not 9,600 BCE. The scale is wrong, impressive, but not continent-sized. If this was Atlantis, Plato, or his sources somehow misplaced it in time by 8,000 years. The Azores fit the location Atlantic islands beyond the Pillars of Hercules, sitting on the mid-Atlantic ridge, where geological activity could theoretically sink land masses. But searches have found no archaeological evidence, no ruins, no artifacts, no indication that Bronze Age civilization existed there. The Cádiz region in Spain aligns with ancient Tartessos, a wealthy civilization known to trade with the Mediterranean. The geography matches reasonably well. But the evidence linking Tartessos to Atlantis is circumstantial, based more on location than specific details. Some point to Bimini Road, in the Bahamas, underwater rock formations that appear geometrically regular, possibly artificial. But geologists who've examined it closely Identify natural beach rock formations, not human construction. Then there are radical theories. Atlantis in Antarctica, they say, before it was covered in ice. This requires pushing the civilization back before the last ice age and assuming climate conditions completely different from what we know. Atlantis in the Caribbean, swallowed by sea level rise. Atlantis in the North Sea, Indonesia, or a dozen other locations, each finding some fragment of evidence while ignoring contradictions. The challenge of underwater archaeology is immense. Continental shelves have been surveyed relatively thoroughly, but deep ocean remains largely unknown. If Atlantis sank in deep water thousands of meters down, finding it would mean searching millions of square miles of seafloor. Modern sonar and submersibles make this theoretically possible, but economically impractical without specific leads. Even if we knew where to look, recognizing what we found would be difficult. 11,000 years underwater would destroy most evidence. Wood would be gone entirely, metal would corrode, stone would erode. The concentric rings Plato describes might be unrecognizable after millennia of current, sediment, and biological action. Yet absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Troy was considered myth until Heinrich Schliemann excavated it. Pompeii was lost and forgotten for 17 centuries. Machu Picchu was overgrown and unknown until 1911. Göbekli Tepe was only discovered in 1994, immediately rewriting our understanding of prehistoric capabilities. Major archaeological discoveries still happen. Perhaps Atlantis remains undiscovered, not because it's mythical, but because we haven't looked in the right place or haven't recognized what we're seeing. The catch-22 is academic. Mainstream archaeology dismisses Atlantis as allegorical fiction or pseudoscience. Previous false discoveries have created skepticism about any new claims. Proposing serious Atlantis research can damage academic careers. It's associated with fringe theories and conspiracy thinking. So serious scholars avoid it, meaning systematic searches with proper funding don't happen. But if you can't get funding because the establishment considers it pseudoscience, and it remains pseudoscience because no funded research produces evidence, how do you break that cycle? Satellite technology can detect subtle patterns, vegetation changes, over buried structures on land, geometric anomalies on ocean floors. Various researchers claim to have identified such patterns that might be Atlantis, but verifying these claims requires expensive underwater excavation that rarely gets funded for speculative searches. The ocean is vast, deep, and protective of its secrets. Shipwrecks lie undiscovered for centuries. Ancient cities rest beneath silt and sand. Entire coastlines swallowed by rising seas remain unknown. If Atlantis sank, if it was real, if Plato's account preserves even distorted truth, it's down there somewhere, waiting in the cold and silence, patient in a way only geological time permits. The ocean has swallowed empires before, and it doesn't give them back without a fight. Perhaps one day someone will look in exactly the right place. Perhaps that day will never come. The mystery persists. For over 2,000 years, people have been arguing about Atlantis, not just whether it existed, but what it means. Plato's students couldn't agree. Some thought he was recording history, others insisted it was philosophical allegory. Aristotle reportedly dismissed it as fiction his teacher invented to make a point about ideal societies and their corruption. But the geographer Strabo treated it as potentially real, discussing it alongside other ancient lands he considered historical. The debate never ended. It just changed forms as centuries passed and cultures evolved. Medieval Europe largely forgot Atlantis, focused on Christian theology and biblical history. But Islamic scholars preserved the story, discussing it in geographic and historical texts, keeping the question alive in regions where Greek philosophy remained studied and valued. The Renaissance brought Plato's works back to European consciousness. Suddenly, philosophers were reading about this lost civilization again, and the timing was perfect. European explorers were discovering continents that ancient Greeks never mentioned. Perhaps America was Atlantis, some theorized. Perhaps the New World was Plato's lost empire, rediscovered after millennia. Francis Bacon wrote New Atlantis in 1626, imagining a utopian society inspired by Plato's account. His version wasn't about what Atlantis was, but what it could represent: human potential, scientific advancement, social order perfected through reason and knowledge. Each era did this, projecting contemporary concerns onto the ancient story. Enlightenment rationalists generally dismissed Atlantis as allegory, arguing that Plato obviously invented it as a teaching tool. But the story persisted in esoteric traditions, mystery schools, and occult societies that claimed secret knowledge passed down from Atlantean survivors. Whether anyone believed these claims or simply found them useful frameworks for organizing other ideas, the Atlantis concept remained culturally active. The 19th century exploded with Atlantis interest. Archaeology was becoming a legitimate science, discovering Troy and other cities previously considered mythical. If Troy was real, why not Atlantis? Ignatius Donnelly published Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, in 1882, arguing that Atlantis was historical fact and the origin point for multiple ancient civilizations. His book became wildly popular, spawning imitators and establishing Atlantis firmly in mass culture. Each generation saw in Atlantis what they needed to see. Romantic poets emphasized tragic beauty, paradise lost, greatness destroyed, the melancholy of vanished glory. Victorian imperialists saw evidence of ancient empire, perhaps validation for their own colonial projects. Early 20th century writers used Atlantis to explore anxieties about technological warfare after World War I, demonstrated that advanced civilizations could destroy themselves quite efficiently. Modern popular culture can't stop returning to Atlantis. Films, novels, television shows, video games, all present different versions, but share common elements. Advanced technology far beyond what the era should possess. Mysterious powers that seem magical but might be science. Catastrophic destruction that erases everything. Disney's animated film, Stargate's science fiction series, Aquaman's underwater kingdoms, video games placing players in Atlantean ruins. The specifics vary wildly, but the fascination remains constant. This reveals something important. When we write about Atlantis, we're writing about ourselves. Our fears that we're repeating their mistakes. Our hopes that we might learn from the past and avoid their fate. Our persistent belief that somewhere in history, humanity achieved something extraordinary that we've since lost. Whether that's technological sophistication, social harmony, spiritual wisdom, or simply a different way of being human. The conspiracy theory industry has claimed Atlantis too. Ancient aliens supposedly helped build it. Secret societies supposedly preserve its knowledge. New Age movements claim channeled messages from Atlantean spirits. This association with pseudoscience makes academic archaeologists dismiss serious Atlantis research, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy where it can't be studied legitimately because it's not considered legitimate. But here's the thing. Whether Atlantis physically existed doesn't determine whether it's real. It exists culturally, psychologically, mythologically. It's real in human imagination, influencing how we think about civilization, progress, achievement, and loss for over 2 millennia. Myths don't need historical accuracy to convey truth. They communicate experiences and concerns that transcend specific facts. Atlantis is every civilization that rose and fell, every golden age that tarnished, every empire that seemed permanent until it wasn't. It's deeply personal too. Every individual experiences their own Atlantis, in the innocence lost, relationships ended, versions of ourselves we can never return to. We all carry lost worlds inside us. That's why this story won't let us go. Atlantis is everywhere and nowhere, in every ruin, every fading photograph, every memory of something beautiful that can never return. Plato didn't write about Atlantis just to describe a lost civilization. He presented it explicitly as moral warning, a society that began virtuously but gradually corrupted through power and wealth until destruction came as consequence. Whether he invented this lesson or reported actual history, the warning itself remains uncomfortably relevant. The first warning is hubris. Atlantis was powerful, technologically advanced, wealthy beyond measure. This bred the arrogance that makes civilizations vulnerable, the belief that human achievement creates invulnerability to nature or fate. They thought they could conquer anyone, control anything, that their prosperity was permanent and guaranteed. This illusion left them unprepared when catastrophe arrived. We've achieved technological sophistication that would seem godlike to ancient peoples. Yet we face existential threats that our technology created or amplified: climate change, nuclear weapons, biological risks, artificial intelligence dangers. Like Atlantis, we struggle to take these threats seriously because immediate conditions seem fine. The catastrophe is always theoretical, always in the future, always something we'll address later when it becomes urgent. The second warning is environmental limits. Atlantis exploited its environment, deforesting the island, depleting resources, polluting the canals, until the degradation made their civilization fragile. They exceeded carrying capacity, destroyed ecosystems they depended on, created vulnerabilities that left them exposed when additional shocks arrived. Our patterns are identical but accelerated: fossil fuel extraction changing atmospheric chemistry, deforestation eliminating carbon sinks and species habitat, ocean acidification killing coral reefs, topsoil erosion reducing agricultural productivity. We understand the mechanisms better than Atlanteans ever could, yet we continue driving toward the same outcome. The third warning is inequality. Atlantean prosperity was built on exploitation, rigid class divisions, massive slave populations, wealth concentrated in elite hands while the majority struggled. This eventually destabilized society from within, making collective response to crisis impossible. When catastrophe came, every faction pursued its own survival, ensuring collective doom. Rising inequality in modern societies creates similar dynamics: political polarization intensifying, social trust eroding, different groups viewing each other as enemies rather than fellow citizens. These conditions prevent the coordinated responses that existential threats require. We can't address shared dangers when we can't agree they're real or that they're shared. The fourth warning is short-term thinking. Atlantean leaders prioritized immediate gains over long-term sustainability. Build ships now, even if it exhausts forests. Expand empire now, even if it overextends resources. Maximize current wealth, even if it creates future instability. Their institutional incentives rewarded quarterly thinking, not generational planning. Our economic and political systems operate on similar timescales. Corporations maximize shareholder value each quarter. Politicians focus on the next election cycle. Nobody gets rewarded for preventing disasters that won't occur for decades. The long-term consequences of our decisions remain somebody else's problem, some future generation's burden. Why do civilizations repeat these mistakes despite historical evidence? Partly cognitive biases: we assume the future resembles the past, that catastrophes happen elsewhere but not here. Partly institutional incentives that reward short-term success over long-term sustainability. Partly collective action problems where coordination fails because individual actors benefit from non-cooperation. Partly psychological denial, because accepting civilizational fragility is terrifying. The Atlantis story should function as pattern recognition. This is what collapse looks like from the inside. The people living through it probably didn't see it coming until too late. They normalized warning signs. They rationalized problems. They believed they were special, exempt from historical patterns that destroyed others. Sound familiar? Perhaps we can do better. We have knowledge, technology, global communication that previous civilizations lacked. We could acknowledge vulnerability, prioritize sustainability, reduce inequality, invest in resilience, heed warnings we receive. But this requires overcoming the same barriers that broke every previous civilization. History suggests pessimism. Complex, successful societies seem to inevitably develop the dysfunctions that destroy them. But history doesn't determine futures, only illuminates possibilities. Perhaps we'll be different. Perhaps we'll repeat the pattern. The choice remains open. Atlantis didn't fail because they were primitive or unlucky. They failed for exactly the reasons we might fail, which is why the story won't let us go. Here's what no one tells you about Atlantis. It's not really about an island. It's about loss, which is the most universal human experience. Everyone has a personal Atlantis they carry inside them, a world that existed once and can never exist again. Maybe yours is childhood, the way home felt before you understood that adults were fallible, before you knew about mortality and cruelty, and all the complications that make innocence impossible to maintain. The backyard that seemed infinite, the summers that felt endless, the certainty that tomorrow would always come and would always be good. Maybe it's a relationship that defined you until it ended. Not necessarily romantic, though often that. The friend who knew you completely until they didn't. The parent you lost before saying everything that needed saying. The version of a partnership before something broke that couldn't be repaired. That world where that person existed in your life, that was your Atlantis. Maybe it's a place. The neighborhood before gentrification changed it beyond recognition. The forest you played in that became a parking lot. The city you loved before you had to leave, or before it evolved into something unfamiliar. The building where important moments happened, demolished to make room for something new. Maybe it's a version of yourself. The person you were before, trauma or illness or disappointment, or just time and experience reshaped you into someone different. The dreams you once held with absolute certainty before life taught you they were impossible or unwise, or simply not for you. The potential you believed in before reality imposed its limits. Atlantis is the perfect metaphor for these losses, because it combines totality with beauty, with suddenness. Completely gone, irrecoverable, perfect and golden in memory, whether it actually was or not. Destroyed in a single day and night, the way life can change in an instant that divides everything into before and after. Different people connect with the story for different reasons. The nostalgic find permission to mourn what's gone, while finding beauty in the mourning itself. The disillusioned find acknowledgement that golden ages don't last, that ideals fail, that heroes prove human. The ambitious see inspiration mixed with warning greatness is possible but impermanent. The anxious find validation that their fears aren't paranoia, that catastrophe can indeed strike without warning, that nothing is guaranteed. We tell this story repeatedly because it helps process loss by externalizing it. Easier to contemplate a lost civilization than fully face our own losses, but thinking about one helps process the other. The story provides structure for experiences that otherwise feel formless and overwhelming. Atlantis has a beginning, middle, end, a narrative arc that gives shape to chaos. There's strange comfort in ruins. They prove that what was destroyed was real and significant. If we can find traces, we can remember. If we can remember, perhaps the loss isn't total. This is why people obsessively search for Atlantis, not for archaeological reasons, but because proving it existed would validate the sense that something profound has been lost. That our feeling of having been diminished isn't imagination but recognition of actual diminishment. But here's the hope embedded in the story. If Atlantis fell but is remembered, if survivors carried knowledge forward, if the story inspired later civilizations, then perhaps destruction isn't the end. Perhaps what we build and learn and love survives in unpredictable ways, in fragments, in influences, in the cultural DNA of what comes after. Perhaps our efforts matter, even if they don't last forever. Atlantis is both warning and comfort. Warning that nothing lasts, that every golden age fades, that permanence is illusion. But comfort that loss is universal and shared, that you're not alone in carrying ruins inside you. If nothing is permanent, we're free to create and love and build without the crushing pressure of making it eternal. We can appreciate things precisely because they're temporary, beautiful because they're fragile. You've been to Atlantis. You live there still, in the parts of yourself that remember what cannot return. And that's both the saddest and most human thing about you.